She wore a wedding dress like one wears a shroud, pure white, cold, and without escape. Kassan Moretti stood at the altar like a statue cast from darkness, the most powerful mob boss in Chicago, the man who had waited 7 years to destroy the Vale family. And tonight, he was taking his enemy's daughter as his wife, not for love, but for revenge. But when he unzipped that wedding dress, he found something no one expected. Scars. Dozens of scars. And everything he had believed in for the past 7 years shattered completely in a single second. This is the story of a marriage that began with hatred and ended with something even more terrifying than love. Watch to the end, like, and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The rain came in sideways that night, hammering the tall stained glass windows of the cathedral like it was trying to break through and warn everyone inside. It didn't matter. Nobody inside St. Verena was listening to warnings anymore. The invitations had gone out. The cars had arrived. The city's most powerful people, politicians, crime bosses, federal judges who owed favors, had taken their seats in polished mahogany pews and arranged their faces into expressions of careful neutrality. They were here to witness something that looked like a wedding. It wasn't. Seraphine Vale understood that the moment she stepped out of the black town car and felt the rain touch the bare skin of her shoulders, and the first thing she thought wasn't about the man waiting at the end of the aisle. It was about escape routes. She had been cataloging them for 3 days. The service exit through the kitchen, the loading dock behind the rectory, the narrow alley that fed out onto West Monroe where she could disappear into the city's wet dark. She had memorized all of them the way a person memorizes the location of fire extinguishers in a building they expect to burn. She hadn't used any of them. That fact said more about her situation than anything else could. Her dress was ivory silk, architectural in its structure, with a high neck that her stylist had chosen deliberately to cover the older bruising along her collarbone. The designer had assumed she wanted elegance. What she'd actually wanted was armor. The train dragged along the wet pavement outside before she gathered it up herself, not waiting for the attendant, and walked through the cathedral doors with her chin level and her hands completely steady. Seraphine Vale had survived worse than this. She just hadn't survived anything that looked quite so much like a ceremony. The interior of St. Verena smelled of something old, stone dust and candle smoke, and the particular cold of spaces that have held too much human emotion for too long. The pews were full. She didn't look at the faces. She looked at the aisle, at the dark marble floor reflecting the candlelight in long amber streaks. And she put one foot in front of the other with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned long ago that the only way through a terrible thing was straight through the center of it. At the far end of the aisle, Kassan Moretti stood watching her. She had seen photographs of him. Every person in Chicago had seen photographs of him. The society pages ran his image when he attended charity events. The crime reporters used old surveillance shots when they wrote their carefully worded pieces that never quite accused him of anything specific. In the photographs, he always looked contained, controlled, like a man who had decided years ago that he would never give anyone a reaction worth documenting. In person, he was something else entirely. He was tall, taller than she'd registered from the photographs, and he wore a black suit that had been cut to fit him with a precision that bordered on obsessive. No pocket square, no boutonniere, nothing decorative at all. His hair was dark and worn close, and his face was the kind of face that had been handsome once and then something had happened to it. Not violence exactly, more like years of deliberate erasure, until what remained was something past handsome and into dangerous territory. His eyes tracked her from the moment she entered the door, and they didn't move from her face as she walked the entire length of the aisle. And by the time she stopped at his side, she felt those eyes like a physical pressure against the side of her jaw. He didn't smile. She hadn't expected him to. The officiant spoke. Seraphine heard the words in fragments, dearly gathered, solemn occasion, bonds of matrimony. And she stood still inside her dress and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and kept her eyes forward. Beside her, Cassian was utterly motionless. He might have been carved from the same dark marble as the floor. He repeated his vows in a voice that was low and even and completely without inflection, like he was confirming an invoice. When it was her turn, she repeated hers in the same register. What else was there? The rings were placed. The officiant pronounced them. Cassian turned toward her for the required moment of ceremony, and as he leaned the fraction of an inch required by tradition, she felt his breath warm against her ear, and he said it so quietly that no one 3 feet away could possibly have heard. "You're going to spend the rest of your life paying for your father's sins." Seraphine turned to face him fully. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the exact quality of the anger in his expression. Not hot, not explosive, but cold and patient and absolutely certain of itself, the way a glacier is certain. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to face the congregation, and she smiled for the cameras. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building in the West Loop that Cassian owned outright, and it looked the way all rooms look when someone with unlimited money and no warmth decorates them. Expensive, precisely arranged, and somehow airless. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. The city sprawled below in its grid of light, rain still dragging across the glass in long diagonal lines. The furniture was charcoal and slate, the art on the walls abstract and dark, and the whole space had the feeling of a room that had been assembled to impress rather than to inhabit. Seraphine stood in the center of it and noted, without particular emotion, that there were no photographs anywhere, no personal objects, nothing that told you a human being actually lived here, rather than visited occasionally to sleep. Behind her, she heard Cassian set his jacket across the back of a chair, the sound of his cufflinks being removed and placed on a glass surface. She had grown up in a house where sounds like that, small, domestic sounds, the sounds of a person settling in, preceded the worst nights. Her body still knew how to respond to them. Her shoulders drew inward a fraction of an inch before she consciously pulled them back. "There's a room prepared for you down the hall," Cassian said. His voice in the empty penthouse sounded different than it had in the cathedral. Drier, more tired. The housekeeper left the details on the bed. "You have access to the East Wing. The West Wing and my office are off limits." Seraphine turned around. He was standing across the room, jacket gone, loosening the collar of his shirt, and he was looking at her the way you look at a problem you've been handed and aren't entirely sure how to begin solving. "That's the arrangement," she said. "That's the arrangement." "For how long?" Something shifted in his face, a fractional tightening around the eyes. "For however long it takes." "Takes for what?" "For the veil name to mean what I need it to mean." He picked up a glass of water from the counter and drank from it with his back half turned to her. "Your family's business relationships, the boards you sit on, the connections your father built over 30 years. Those belong to me now. That's what this is." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. The rain hit the windows. 42 stories below, the city moved through its night without any awareness of the 2 people standing inside this particular square of light. "My father is dead," she said. "I'm aware." "Then whatever he did to you, your father destroyed a deal that cost me 8 lives and $40 million. Cassian set the glass down and turned to face her directly. "He fed information to my enemies for 3 years while sitting at my table and eating my food. When I found out, he disappeared before I could collect. 6 months later, he was dead from a car accident that was very convenient for him." His voice was still even, still patient. "So yes, your father is dead. That's why I married his daughter instead." The words landed the way they were meant to, blunt, without cruelty, but without apology. He wasn't angry. That was what was most disturbing about him. He had built this entire architecture of revenge with the same emotional temperature you'd use to plan a business acquisition. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. "I'd like to change out of this dress," she said finally. He gestured toward the hall. She walked past him, carrying the train of her silk gown through his expensive airless penthouse, and she did not let herself feel anything until she was through the bedroom door and she heard it close behind her. The room was large and impersonal, in the same way as the rest of the apartment. Cream walls, a king bed in charcoal linen. On the bedside table, a folded card with the housekeeper's neat handwriting detailing the Wi-Fi password, the intercom system, and which buttons on the various remotes controlled which functions. Seraphine set the card aside without reading it all the way through. She reached behind herself to find the zipper of her dress, couldn't quite reach the top, and stood in the center of the room for a moment with her arm twisted backward and the zip halfway down. And then she thought about calling for help and immediately dismissed it. And then she thought about asking Cassian and felt her stomach turn over hard and cold. and instead she worked at the angle until her shoulder protested sharply and the zipper moved the last 2 inches and the dress loosened around her. She stepped out of it carefully. It had cost someone a great deal of money, and she was neither careless nor ungrateful, even now, and laid it across the chair in the corner with the same deliberate tidiness she'd practiced for years. Then she stood in the quiet room in her slip and her heels, and she looked at herself in the mirror above the dresser. The slip covered most of it. She knew that. She'd chosen it for that reason, weeks ago when she understood this day was actually going to happen. But the mirror's angle caught the light in a particular way, and she could see the edge of the oldest scar, the one that curved from the bottom of her left shoulder blade down toward her hip, smooth and white and unmistakable for what it was. She turned away from the mirror and sat on the edge of the bed. In the other room, she could hear nothing. No television, no phone call, just the distant sound of rain. She should sleep. She should be practical. She should inventory what she had, what she knew, what leverage existed in a situation where she had no allies in a stranger's house on the 42nd floor of a building she'd never entered before tonight. Seraphine Vale had survived by being practical, by thinking past the feeling in her chest to the next necessary action. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep for a very long time. Oh, the morning came gray and wet, the same rain dragging itself across the windows. Seraphine was dressed before 7. Dark trousers, a high-neck blouse, her hair pulled back with the kind of controlled precision she'd learned to wear like a second skin. When she came out of the bedroom, Cassian was already at the kitchen counter with coffee and his phone, and he was on a call that involved a great deal of quiet, controlled anger delivered in the kind of shorthand that only made sense if you understood the structure of what was being discussed. She moved past him to find the coffee herself. She heard him end the call. "Sit down," he said. Not harshly, just flatly. "I'm getting coffee. There's something we need to discuss. I'm getting coffee first." A pause. She heard the particular quality of silence that was him deciding whether to push it and then deciding not to. She poured her coffee, turned, and sat at the far end of the kitchen counter with both hands wrapped around the mug. Cassian looked at her. In the morning light, he looked slightly less carved from stone. There was a tiredness under his eyes that the low lighting of the penthouse had concealed the night before, and he was wearing a plain dark shirt instead of the severe tailoring of yesterday, which made him seem fractionally more like a person and fractionally less like an event. "You grew up in the Vale estate," he said. "Your father's house in Lincoln Park." "Yes. After he died, who took control of the estate?" Seraphine's hands tightened fractionally around her mug. "Why?" "Because 3 of your father's former business partners have contacted my people in the last 48 hours. They're concerned about the property transfers that happened after his death. Assets moved out of the Vale family trust into a holding company that nobody can trace." His eyes stayed on her face. "The name Roland Vane keeps appearing." The coffee mug was warm against her palms. She concentrated on that. "Roland is my step-uncle," she said carefully. "My father's half-brother. He became my guardian after the accident." "How old were you?" 17. Cassian studied her. His expression was doing the same controlled thing it always did, unreadable surface over whatever calculation was happening underneath. "The asset transfers were illegal. I have enough documentation to confirm that. What I don't have is why. What Vane wanted with the Vale family holdings specifically." He paused. "You were living in that house for 4 years after your father died. I'm asking if you have information that's relevant." The rain moved against the windows. Seraphine set her coffee mug down on the counter. She looked at Cassian Moretti, the most feared man in Chicago, who had married her to punish her dead father, who spoke in the flat, even voice of someone who had surgically removed every impulse except strategy. And she thought about what she was about to say and what it would cost her to say it. "If I tell you," she said slowly, "what do I get?" Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth. He didn't have warmth to shift, but a slight recalibration, like she'd said something he hadn't anticipated. "What do you want?" he said. "Protection. Real protection. Not because you're using me for my name and my connections, because if Roland finds out I talked to you, if he finds out I'm in this building, he will come for me. He has resources, and he has people, and he has reasons to want me silent that you don't know about yet." She held his gaze. Her voice was steady, It had taken years to make her voice this steady. So I need to know that I'm not just a piece you move around the board and sacrifice when you're done with it. I need to know that you'll keep me alive. The silence ran long. You have my word, Cassian said. Your word. She said it without inflection. My word has kept this organization alive for 14 years. Seraphine picked up her coffee, took a sip, set it down again. Roland Vane doesn't move money, she said. That's not what the holding companies are for. The money is a mechanism. What Roland moves is people. Cassian went very still. He runs a trafficking network, she said. Has for at least 10 years. Politicians, law enforcement, judges. He has relationships built at every level, which is why nothing ever gets traced back to him. The Vale family assets were useful to him because the trust had legitimate international business connections. Shell companies in 3 countries. Moving money through a respected family trust is cleaner than building the infrastructure from scratch. She paused. He's been planning a Senate run for 2 years. The campaign is real, or real enough that it's useful cover. A man running for public office is the last person anyone looks at for organized crime. She said it all flatly, factually, in the same register he used for everything. When she was done, she picked up her coffee again and drank. Cassian hadn't moved. How long have you known? He said. Most of it for years, all of it for about 18 months. And you said nothing. To who? She looked at him directly. To the police he owns? To the federal agents he golfs with? To the press that's been taking his money for a decade? She set the mug down. I was 17 when my father died and Roland became my guardian. I was alone in that house with him for 4 years. I had no money of my own, no allies, no way out that he couldn't close. Her voice stayed level. So no, I said nothing. I survived. The word landed in the room and sat there. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Not the calculating look, not the strategic assessment, something else entirely, something she couldn't read and didn't know what to do with. Then he said, How did your father die? Seraphine looked at the rain on the windows. The official report says his car went off the Fullerton Bridge at 2 a.m, she said. Single car accident. Blood alcohol twice the legal limit. She paused. My father didn't drink. What came after that conversation was not a thaw. It was more like a shift in barometric pressure before a storm, a change in the quality of the air between them that didn't make anything easier, but at least made it more honest. Cassian spent the rest of that day on calls. Seraphine spent it exploring the limits of the East Wing's access, which were more generous than she'd expected, and reading through every document she could access on the building's internal network using the password from the housekeeper's card. There was less there than she'd hoped, but more than he probably intended. She was careful about it. She always was. The second night, she ate dinner at the kitchen counter because he was still working and there was no one else. The third morning, he had a car take her to a building downtown where his legal team sat in a conference room and walked her through documents for 3 hours. Corporate structures, asset transfers, the threads of Roland Vane's financial architecture laid out across a 20-foot table. She answered their questions with the careful precision of someone who has been waiting a long time to finally be asked. It was on the third night that everything changed. She woke at 4 a.m. from a dream she couldn't hold on to once she was awake. Only the feeling of it, which was the feeling she always had after those particular dreams. Smothered, like the air pressure had changed and she was breathing through something dense and resistant. She sat up in the dark and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until the feeling passed. Then she heard something outside her door. She crossed to it and opened it before she thought too carefully about whether she should. The hallway beyond was dim, lit by low baseboard lights, and at the far end Cassian stood with his back against the wall and his phone in his hand, looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city below. He was in dark trousers and a white shirt open at the throat. He hadn't slept either. He turned when she opened the door. For a moment they looked at each other across the length of the hallway. "I heard you up," he said. His voice was different at 4 a.m. Something had gotten out of it. Not all the control, but enough of the performance that it was lighter, somehow, closer to the ground. "The same," she said. He looked back at this window. She came down the hallway and stood beside him, not too close, both of them looking at the city's nighttime grid from this height. and the rain had finally stopped, and everything below was wet and still and humming with its usual frequency. "You do this often," she said. "More lately." A pause. "I used to be better at sleeping." "What changed?" He was quiet. The city moved 42 floors below them. "I found a file 3 weeks ago, before the wedding. Something my investigator pulled about the Vale estate after your father's death." His jaw moved. "Medical records. Filed under administrative error, no name attached. I didn't understand what I was looking at until I'd been married to you for 48 hours. Seraphine looked at the window. "I would have handled the wedding differently," he said. "What I said to you during the vows. Would you have?" "Yes." She considered that. "But you still would have married me." "Yes." "For the same reasons. The reasons are still valid." He said it without apology, but also without the cold satisfaction it had carried the first night. "What Roland is doing is connected to things I've been trying to dismantle for 2 years. I need the Vale family access to do it. That hasn't changed." He paused. "But I said something I shouldn't have said, to a person who didn't deserve it. It was not an elaborate apology. It was not warm. But coming from him at 4 in the morning, it was something." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "I need you to understand something," she said, "about why this matters. About Roland specifically." Her voice stayed even, but she could hear the thread of something else in it, something she kept to the back of her throat. "The women he moves through that network, they're not abstractions to me. I know what that looks like from the inside of a house where it happens. I know what it costs." She paused. "I've spent 4 years surviving that house and waiting for an opportunity that was big enough to actually do something. I'm not going to waste it because you and I got started wrong." Cassian turned to look at her. In the low light, the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen before. Not strategic, not contained. He was just looking at her, the way you look at something when you've had to completely revise your understanding of what it is. "We didn't get started wrong," he said. "We got started before we had information." Seraphine looked at the city. "I want Roland," she said. "I know. Not just his network. Not just his assets. I want him to face what he's done." "Yes." "Can you do that?" "That's what I'm good at." The city hummed below them. The wet streets caught light in long reflections. Somewhere far below, a car moved through an intersection, and its headlights swept across the pavement and disappeared. "Then we should work together," Seraphine said. Cassian was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, we should." Neither of them moved for a while after that. They stood at the window in the 4 in the morning quiet of the city, and the distance between them was smaller than it had been, and neither of them named what that meant, because naming things too early was how you broke them before they were strong enough to hold their own weight. What? The next 2 weeks moved differently than the first 3 days had. Cassian's people were good. She'd understood that abstractly, but seeing it up close was something else. The operation they were assembling to dismantle Roland's network was methodical and patient, and went about its work the way serious professional destruction always does, quietly, with documentation, without wasted motion. There were 3 investigators she worked with closely. She gave them everything she had: dates, names, account structures, the locations of physical records she'd memorized years ago, while Roland thought she was simply in the next room being afraid of him. She had always been better at observation than Roland gave her credit for. In the evening, sometimes, she and Cassian were in the same room without it being about Roland at all. He read at the kitchen counter while she worked on the east side of the couch. She asked him once about one of the abstract paintings on the wall, a piece that seemed out of place with the rest of the controlled dark decor, looser and more unresolved. And he told her he'd bought it at an estate sale from a family he'd helped years ago, when he was still working his way into his current position, and it reminded him of something he'd seen as a child. He didn't say what. She didn't ask. She stopped locking the bathroom door on the 9th day. She noticed him notice that. He didn't comment on it. One evening, he brought her 2 fingers of bourbon without asking, set it on the table beside her, and went back to his own work. And she looked at the glass for a moment and then drank it, and neither of them treated it as anything other than what it was: an ordinary human gesture between 2 people who were, against all reasonable expectation, beginning to understand each other. She was not naive. She had not stopped thinking clearly. She knew who he was and what he'd built and the specific shape of the violence that had built it. She knew that her attraction to his competence and his honesty was not the same as safety. But she also knew that the 4 years in Roland's house had taught her the exact difference between a man who had power over you and used it to diminish you, and a man who had power over you and used it toward something else. Something that at least had the possibility of growth in it. She held that distinction carefully, like a flame in a high wind, and she didn't let herself move too fast. What she could not yet see, what none of Cassian's careful investigation had yet surfaced, was the particular rot that had already taken hold inside the Moretti organization. The person inside those walls who had been moving information outward for longer than anyone knew. The thread that Roland had spent years quietly cultivating, waiting for exactly the moment when Cassian came close enough to be truly dangerous. The thread that would unravel everything. On the 14th night, she dreamed again. Not the smothered dream, but something different, clearer. In it, she was standing in the Vale Estate hallway at 17 years old. But now she was also herself at 24, watching her younger self from the far end of the corridor. She wanted to call out, tell her something. She couldn't find the words before she woke. She lay in the dark and listened to the building settle around her and thought about the Moretti Foundation gala that was coming in 10 days. Cassian had evidence. Financial records she'd retrieved from the Vale Estate's hidden archives, 6 months before the wedding, copied to an encrypted drive she'd kept hidden in the lining of her suitcase. Records that could put Roland Vane's trafficking operation in front of a federal grand jury before he could bury it. The gala was the right venue. Every power player in Chicago in one room, cameras and press and witnesses everywhere. The cleanest public moment to pull the trigger on everything they'd built. She believed that. She just couldn't shake the feeling, lying in the dark in Cassian Moretti's penthouse on the 14th night of her impossible marriage, that somewhere in the machinery of the plan, something was already going wrong. She was right. She just didn't know it yet. 3 days before the gala, a man named Dante Reeve sat in the back of a car on Michigan Avenue and made a phone call. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, he sat for a moment looking at his own reflection in the tinted window, and then he picked up his second phone, the one nobody at the Moretti organization knew he carried, and sent a single message. Everything is in position. 2 miles away, in a building with no name on its door, Roland Vane read the message and poured himself a drink, and smiled. The morning 3 days before the gala started with a problem nobody anticipated and ended with Cassian putting his fist through a wall. It wasn't the wall of the penthouse. It was the wall of a loading dock office on the south side of the city, inside a warehouse that the Moretti organization used for legitimate freight storage and, occasionally, less legitimate conversations. Seraphine heard about it secondhand from one of the investigators, a woman named Priya, who wore her hair in a severe bun and had the precise, economical manner of someone who had spent years in work where imprecision got people killed. Priya told her with no particular expression that there had been an incident at the South Warehouse, that 2 men had been found, that Cassian had gone down to handle it personally. What kind of incident? Seraphine said. Priya looked at her for a moment with the particular look of someone calculating exactly how much information was appropriate. 2 of our people, Priya said finally. Long term. Both found in the warehouse at 3 this morning by the overnight guard. Both dead. Seraphine absorbed that. How? Single shot each, close range, execution style. Priya's voice stayed flat. The bodies were arranged, deliberately, facing the door so whoever came in would see them immediately. Someone wanted them found. Yes. Someone wanted us to know they'd been inside. Yes. Seraphine stood at the window of the conference room where she'd spent the last week working through Roland's financial architecture, and she looked at the city below and she thought about what it meant to leave a message like that. Not a quiet elimination, a declaration. Who were they, she said. 2 of our longest-serving security people. Both had been with Cassian for over a decade. The implications settled in the room between them like smoke. If Roland's people had gotten to men with that kind of tenure, men who knew the organization's structure, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, it meant the breach was older and deeper than anyone had understood. It didn't mean those 2 men were the source of the leak. It might mean they'd simply gotten close to figuring out who was. She turned from the window. Where is Cassian now? On his way back. Tell him I need to see him when he arrives." Priya looked at her steadily. "He's not going to be in a conversational mood." "I know." Seraphine picked up the documents she'd been working through and straightened them against the table's edge with a crisp tap. "Tell him anyway. Sup." He came through the penthouse door 40 minutes later, and the energy that preceded him into the room was the kind that makes the air feel smaller. He was in a dark jacket and dark trousers, and there was a rust-colored stain on the cuff of his left sleeve that he hadn't noticed or hadn't cared about, and his jaw was set in a way that made the muscle beneath it visible. He stopped when he saw her standing in the kitchen. "Priya told you," he said. "Yes." He moved past her to the sink, turned the water on cold, and ran his right hand under it for a moment. The knuckle skin was split in two places. She looked at it and didn't say anything. "Sal Benedetti," he said, turning the water off and reaching for a cloth. 18 years with this organization. Started when I was 26 and he was 40, and I needed someone who understood the docs better than I did. He had a daughter. I paid for her college." He pressed the cloth to his knuckles without looking at it. "Marcus Webb, 15 years. Best logistics mind I've ever worked with. He and his wife had dinner at this table 3 months ago." Seraphine was quiet. "Whoever did this," he said, and stopped. "Whoever did this wanted you to know they could," she said carefully. "They're not trying to collapse the organization. They're trying to rattle it. Rattle you. Before the gala." Cassian looked at her. "They know about the gala," he said. "They know something. They might not know the specifics, the evidence, the timing, the public nature of it, but someone has told them enough to know that whatever you're planning, it's close." His jaw tightened further. He set the cloth down on the counter. 3 days, he said. 3 days? She agreed. We push it up or we hold. We can't push it up. The financial documentation needs another 48 hours of authentication. If we move early with incomplete records, Roland's lawyers bury it in a week and we never get a second shot. Then we hold, and we figure out how deep the breach goes. She paused. Cash-in. The 2 men who died, they may have been getting close to the source. That might be why they were killed. He looked at her with the kind of look that said he'd already thought of this, and it was doing nothing good for him. I know, he said, which means the source is still inside, and they know we're watching for them. I know that too. And they're going to move again before the gala. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary afternoon with no awareness of any of this. I need you to stay in this building, Cassian said. His voice had flattened back to its working register, the operational tone, stripped of the 4 in the morning quality that had become quietly her preferred version of him. I need you not to go anywhere without 2 of my people until this is resolved. I understand. I'm not asking. I know you're not. She held his gaze. I'm saying I understand. There's a difference. He looked at her for a moment. Something in the rigid set of his shoulders shifted a fraction. Not released, just redistributed. He nodded once. I have to make calls, he said. I know. He moved toward the office. She watched him go and thought about the rust-colored stain on his cuff, and the split skin on his knuckles, and the name Sal Benedetti, and the fact that this man had paid for a dead man's daughter's education and would probably never mention it to anyone. She turned back to the kitchen counter and poured 2 coffees and left one on the edge of the office door where he would see it. Dante Reeve arrived at the penthouse that evening at 6. He was Cassian's consigliere. The word was old, formal, the kind of title that in the Moretti organization carried genuine weight. He'd held the position for 9 years. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with the kind of face that was easy to trust, open, attentive, quick with a self-deprecating comment that made him seem less formidable than he was. He had the social intelligence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where reading the temperature correctly was the difference between going home and not going home. Seraphine had met him twice before the warehouse incident. Both times she'd found him warm, professionally respectful, appropriately cautious in the way that all of Cassian's senior people were cautious around her, still assessing, still calibrating how much she was an asset and how much she was an unknown variable. Tonight he came in and went directly to Cassian, which was normal, and they talked in the office for an hour with the door closed, which was normal. And when Dante came out to get water from the kitchen, He stopped and looked at her across the counter with an expression that was normal in all its surface features. Concerned, steady, the expression of a trusted lieutenant managing a crisis. And something about it made the small hairs on Seraphine's forearms stand up beneath her sleeves. She couldn't name it. She was good at not naming things she couldn't yet prove. "Hell of a week," Dante said, filling a glass from the tap. "Yes," she said. "How are you holding up?" "Fine." "The gala is still on, for what it's worth. Cassian won't pull back from something like that. Once he decides on a course, he finishes it." He said it with the ease of a man describing a quality he admired. "You've probably figured that out by now." "I figured some things out," she said. He smiled. It was a good smile. That was part of what bothered her. "He speaks well of you," Dante said. "In case you were wondering, the way he talks about the work you've been doing with the documents." He paused. "He doesn't say that kind of thing easily." "I know." He nodded, refilled the glass, and went back to the office. Seraphine sat with the feeling in her forearms for a long time after that. That night she couldn't sleep again. But it wasn't the dream this time. It was the particular hypervigilance that had kept her alive in the Vale estate, the thing that woke her at 3 a.m. during the years with Roland to listen to the sounds of the house and catalog what was normal and what wasn't. Her body had never fully unlearned it. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, and she thought about Dante Reeves' easy smile and the specific texture of his attention toward her. And she thought about the 2 dead men arranged facing the door. And she thought about what Priya had said. Both long-term, both had been with Cassian for over a decade. She got up. She didn't go to the hallway this time. She went to the small desk in the corner of her room where she'd set up her laptop, and she opened it carefully, and she began very quietly and very methodically to go looking. She wasn't an investigator. She wasn't trained in what she was doing, but she had spent 4 years in Roland Vane's house learning how to find things he wanted hidden, which had given her a working education in the specific logic of concealment, the way people who hid things always left a seam somewhere, because perfect concealment required perfect consistency, and nobody was perfectly consistent forever. She wasn't looking for financial records this time. She was looking at communication patterns, the metadata of Cassian's internal systems, who contacted whom, when, at what frequency, and whether any of those patterns changed in the weeks before the warehouse killings. It took her 2 hours. What she found wasn't proof. It was a seam, a series of encrypted outgoing contacts from a device registered to the organization's internal communications network, beginning 14 months ago and appearing approximately every 3 to 4 weeks. Not from Cassian's devices, not from Priya's, not from any of the 3 investigators she worked with. From a device registered under the name of a freight logistics coordinator who, when she cross-referenced the employment records she had access to, had left the organization 8 months ago, except the outgoing contacts hadn't stopped when the person left. They'd continued, from the same device ID, because the device hadn't left when the coordinator left, because someone had kept it. She sat in the dark with her laptop warm on her knees and her heart beating in a completely controlled and steady rhythm. She had learned long ago how to keep her heart rate down when the thing she'd found was the thing she feared. And she thought about who had access to the organization's full internal communications infrastructure. Not many people. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while longer. Then she got up, dressed, and went to find Cassian. He was in the office. Of course he was. It was 2:30 in the morning, and he was at his desk with 3 physical files open in front of him and his reading glasses. She hadn't known about the reading glasses. They were a detail that did something complicated to her chest, and a half-empty glass of bourbon at his elbow. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." She crossed to the desk and set her laptop in front of him. "Look at this." He looked at it. He took his glasses off, set them on the desk, and looked at it again. She watched his face as he read through what she'd pulled, and she watched the expression go through its controlled processes: assessment, recognition, the careful suppression of whatever the recognition was doing to his chest. "Where did you find this?" he said. "The communications metadata. I had access because of the documentation work." "You went looking on your own." "I went looking because Dante Reeve gave me a bad feeling tonight, and I couldn't sleep." Cassian went very still. She watched him absorb that, watched him take it apart and reassemble it against 9 years of working history and trust, and the particular weight that came with a betrayal of this magnitude. "This isn't proof," he said. "I know. This is a device irregularity that could have 3 other explanations." "I know that too." She sat across from him. "But you feel it, don't you, now that it's in front of you?" His jaw was doing the thing again, the muscle beneath the bone, visible for a moment and then controlled. "Tell me exactly why he gave you a bad feeling," Cassian said. His voice was quiet, quieter than usual. She told him. All of it. The smile, the specific quality of the attention, the way he'd mentioned Cassian speaking well of her in a way that had felt like he was establishing something rather than sharing something. The way a good liar told you true things in a way that was designed to make you feel safe. When she was done, the office was silent. 9 years, Cassian said. She didn't say anything. "He was at my mother's funeral." His voice didn't change in register. It stayed flat, working, operational. But there was something beneath it that was doing something else entirely. "He's the only person in this organization I've ever trusted to know where I sleep." "I know. If this is wrong, then we find out and I'm wrong and we move on. And if it's right," she held his gaze, "then the gala in 3 days is already compromised. And everything we've built to take Roland down is sitting in front of someone who's been feeding him information for over a year." Cassian stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the contained force of it, the kind of stillness that preceded something that needed to not happen right now. "We can't let him know we suspect," she said. "If he disappears before the gala, Roland moves everything and we have nothing." "I know how this works," he said without turning. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." He was quiet for a moment, then he turned. "Tomorrow," he said. "Normal as normal. Dante attends the gala planning meeting at 10. I want you in that meeting." "Why?" "Because I want to watch how he looks at you when he thinks I'm not looking." She absorbed that. "And after the meeting," he said, "I want Priya to begin a full audit of his access to our communications infrastructure, quietly, back-channeled, nothing on the main network." His voice had fully recrossed back into operational territory now. Whatever had been beneath it was under the surface again. "If it's him, I want a complete picture before the gala. And if the picture confirms it before the gala, then I handle it." "Cassian." "I handle it," he said again, and this time the quality in his voice told her exactly what handle it meant, and she looked at him for a long moment and thought about all the things she could say about that, and decided that none of them were appropriate for 2:30 in the morning, and none of them would have made a difference anyway. "Okay," she said. She got up to leave. At the office door, she stopped. "Whatever you decide to do," she said, "don't do it until after Roland is finished. He's the one we came here for." Cassian looked at her across the office. "I know who we came here for," he said. Sad. The next day moved with the particular excruciating quality of a day when you know something enormous is inside it and you cannot get to it yet. The gala planning meeting was at 10, in the same conference room where she'd been working for 2 weeks, and Dante arrived at 9:58 with 2 members of Cassian's security team and a leather folder under his arm, and he greeted Seraphine with the same warm, easy, practiced professionalism she'd always received from him. She watched him. Not obviously. She'd spent years learning how to watch without appearing to watch, how to hold a conversation with one part of her attention while another part cataloged details, the direction of a glance, the timing of a blink, the specific way a person's body responded to a topic before their face could catch up and manage the response. Dante was good. He was genuinely good. There were moments in that 90-minute meeting where she would have believed she was wrong about him, where his input was so practical and specific and so clearly in Cassian's interest that she felt the ground shift slightly beneath her conviction. And then Cassian mentioned, casually, that the financial documentation was now complete. She felt it before she saw it, a micro-adjustment in Dante's breathing, a fractional quickening that was over in a second and then smoothed into attentiveness. She didn't look at Cassian. He didn't look at her. But she knew he'd seen it too. The meeting ended at 11:30. Dante gathered his folder, exchanged a few final words with Cassian about security arrangements for the event, and left. Cassian saw him to the elevator. When he came back into the conference room, he closed the door and stood for a moment with his back against it. Yes, he said. Just that. She nodded. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, a gesture so brief and human that she felt it like something physical. And then he straightened up and became operational again. Get Priya, he said. The 48 hours before the gala were the longest of Seraphine's recent memory, which was saying something given the competition. Priya's audit moved faster than expected. By the second evening, she had a file that was no longer a seam, but it was a window. 14 months of outgoing contacts to a routing address that, when Priya traced it back through 3 separate private servers, resolved to a number registered to a property holding in Roland Vane's name. Not direct contact, never direct. Dante was too careful for that, but close enough, with enough pattern and enough frequency, that it was no longer deniable. Cassian sat with the file for a long time. Seraphine sat across from him and let him sit with it and didn't offer anything. He was there, Cassian said finally. His voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before. Not anger, something heavier. Every conversation I've had about Roland for the last year, every piece of this operation, he was in the room for it. Most of it, she said. Not all. The financial documentation. I worked on that outside normal channels. Priya handled the authentication outside his access radius. So he doesn't know the specifics. Not the specifics. He knows enough to know the gala is the moment. He may know the general nature of what we have. She paused. Which is enough for Roland to know he needs to move first. Cassian set the file down on the table. The gala is tomorrow night, he said. Yes. If we pull Dante now, Roland knows immediately. He has redundant contacts. Dante isn't his only line in. Pulling Dante alerts him that the network's been found. She had thought this through for 2 days. She had gone over it from every angle she knew. If Roland knows we found the breach, he doesn't run. He attacks. He has too much to lose to just disappear. He'll move to destroy what we have before we can use it. Cassian looked at her. You've been running this. Someone had to. I have people. Your people are compromised and you're managing your anger about Dante, which is reasonable. But someone needed to be thinking about the tactical problem, and I was available. She held his gaze without apology. Are you going to be angry about that? A long pause. No, he said. Then here's where I am. We let Dante run one more day. We do not signal that we've found anything. We go to the gala tomorrow night. We execute the plan as constructed. And we have people in position to take Dante the moment the evidence goes public, and Roland no longer has any use for a contact inside your organization. Cassian was quiet. He looked at the file. He looked at her. And if Roland's already moved assets, he said, if he knows we're coming and he's already halfway out of the country, then we have his financial records in front of federal prosecutors and Interpol, and the thing he's built is dismantled whether or not he's personally in handcuffs. She paused. I want him in handcuffs, but I want the network destroyed more. Those are the priorities in that order. She said it and meant it, and he could see that she meant it, and something in his face, not softened exactly, more like it had been put through something and come out the other side, shifted toward her. You're not what I expected, he said. It wasn't a compliment or a surprise. It was just what it was. A factual observation from a man who didn't say things unless he meant them. What did you expect, she said. Someone who needed protecting. She looked at him steadily. I've spent 6 years protecting myself. I'm not stopping now just because there's someone else in the room. He held her gaze. I know. Good. The office was quiet. Outside the windows, Chicago's nighttime skyline pressed its grid of light against the glass. Tomorrow was the Moretti Foundation Gala. Tomorrow night, in a ballroom full of the city's most powerful people, they would either pull the thread that unraveled Roland Vane's empire, or Roland would pull his thread first. She had been working toward this moment for 2 years. She wasn't afraid. She was something colder and more useful than afraid. She was ready. What she couldn't see in the careful architecture of everything they'd built was that Dante had already moved. That 6 hours earlier, while she and Priya were finalizing the audit, Dante Reeve had sent the last message he would ever need to send. Not to a routing address this time, directly to Roland. Tomorrow night. Ballroom. She brings the documents herself. Take her before he can use them. Take them both if you can. She didn't know any of that. She went to bed and lay in the dark and breathed steadily, mapping the next day in her mind with the controlled precision of a woman who had survived everything that had been done to her through sheer force of preparation. In the morning, she would dress for a gala. She would carry the encrypted drive in the lining of the small evening bag she'd chosen for exactly that reason. She would walk into a room full of cameras and witnesses and power brokers, and she would watch Roland Vane's face when everything he'd built began to burn. She had earned this. She had bled for this. She had survived every single thing that had been designed to stop her from reaching this exact moment. She did not know, lying in the dark 36 hours before the gala would explode into gunfire and broken glass and everything falling apart at once, that the one thing she hadn't accounted for was the specific loyalty of a monster who had been patient enough to plan for the moment she finally felt safe. She hadn't accounted for it. And that gap, that single gap in all her careful preparation, was going to cost them everything. The dress she chose for the gala was deep burgundy. Not red, not black, something in between, the color of something that had already been through damage and come out the other side of it. She put it on at 6:15 in the evening with the same deliberate focus she applied to everything that mattered, working the zipper herself, checking the lining of the evening bag twice to confirm the encrypted drive was seated correctly against the inner seam where it would read as a phone's edge if anyone ran a basic scan. She looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 4 seconds. Then she turned away and went to find Cassian. He was in the bedroom doorway when she came into the hall, jacket on, tie precisely knotted, the silver cufflinks she'd seen him wear twice before catching the light from the overhead fixture. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the moment had a particular quality to it. Not romantic, not tender, too loaded for either of those words. Like two people standing at the edge of something and taking a breath before they stepped. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. They went downstairs together. Det. The Moretti Foundation Gala was held every year in the Grand Meridian Ballroom on East Walker Drive, 40 floors above the Chicago River, and it was the kind of event that looked from the outside exactly like what it claimed to be, a charity fundraiser for urban education initiatives, full of exactly the kinds of people who appeared in society photographs and gave speeches about civic responsibility. The ballroom itself was enormous, dressed in cream and gold for the evening, with 3 crystal chandeliers running the length of the ceiling and a view of the river and the city's lit grid that stopped you for a moment when you first saw it, even if you'd seen it before. Seraphine had never been here before. She noted the exits as they entered. 4 main doors, 2 service corridors, a kitchen entrance at the northwest corner, 2 staircases, 1 freight elevator requiring a key. The security Cassian had stationed here was visible in a careful way, visible enough to deter, discreet enough not to alarm. She counted 8 she could identify. Assumed there were more she couldn't. The room was already full. Politicians with their careful smiles. Business figures in precisely calibrated evening wear. She recognized 3 federal judges, 2 senators, and a man she knew from Roland's dinner table. A Chicago alderman named Cartwright, who had been a reliable presence at Vail Estate functions for years, who had always looked at her with the particular combination of pity and studied blankness that meant he knew exactly what was happening in that house, and had made his calculation about it long ago. She didn't look at him long enough for it to mean anything. Cassian moved through the room the way he moved through every room, like the space organized itself around him rather than the reverse. People approached him and he received them with the contained graciousness of someone who had long since stopped performing warmth and simply managed interactions. She stayed close, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and played her role. The new wife, present and elegant and not particularly interesting. Dante was already there. She saw him near the east wall, talking to 2 of Cassian's senior financial people, his leather folder tucked under his arm, his face wearing its practiced openness. He caught her eye briefly and nodded. She nodded back. Her face gave him nothing. "He's been here 40 minutes, she said quietly, turning toward Cassian under the pretense of leaning in to hear something he'd said. "I know." His voice was barely above the ambient noise of the room. "Priya is in position at the service corridor. The moment we go public with the documents, her team takes him. And Roland hasn't arrived yet. She absorbed that. He'll come. He won't be able to stay away. If he thinks he's having this intercepted, he needs to be here to manage the fallout personally. That's what I'm counting on. She looked at him sidelong. His profile against the chandeliers was the same controlled topography it always was, but she knew him well enough now to read the things below the surface. The set of his shoulders, the exact tension in his jaw, the way his left hand wasn't quite still at his side. He was furious about Dante. He'd been carrying it for 2 days with the controlled discipline of a man who understood that deployed fury was useful and wasted fury was fatal. Tonight he would get to put it down. She understood that feeling in her body, not just her mind. The first hour passed in the slow burn of high-functioning social performance. Cassian made his rounds. Seraphine stayed close and said the right things to the right people and kept one part of her attention fixed on the room's temperature at all times. The way a good fighter keeps peripheral awareness even when they're looking directly at something. At 8:45, Roland Vane walked into the ballroom. She felt it before she saw him, a change in her own body, something her nervous system had learned years before her conscious mind could catch up to it, a tightening between her shoulder blades, a slight coolness across her skin. Then she turned, and there he was. He was 62 and carried it well, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who photographed the way certain buildings photographed, with an authority that made you feel the structure was load-bearing. He wore a charcoal suit and the specific expression of a man who had arrived at an event he controlled and was simply doing the courtesy of appearing. He moved into the room with 2 men flanking him at a distance that was just far enough to look like coincidence. His eyes found her immediately. She had known they would. She had been prepared for it. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds. Not challenging, not afraid, just present. And then she turned back to the conversation Cassian was holding with the city planning commissioner, and she felt Roland's eyes stay on the back of her neck like a coal pressed to skin. "He's here," she said. Cassian didn't turn. "I see him. He brought 2. I see those 2. A pause. 15 minutes. We move to the presentation at 9. The documentation goes to the screens at 9:10. Okay. Stay close to me. I will. She would, but her hand had already moved to the evening bag at her side, her fingertips confirming the weight of the drive through the fabric. 15 minutes. Everything she had built toward for 2 years was 15 minutes away. She picked up her water glass and took a small, steady sip. 9 o'clock came, and the lights in the ballroom adjusted. A subtle dimming of the peripheral fixtures, a brightening of the presentation area at the room's north end, where a podium and a large projection screen had been arranged. The event's nominal program called for remarks from the Foundation's executive director, followed by a presentation of the year's grant recipients. Standard charity gala format. Invisible. What it actually was, tonight, was the scaffolding around the moment Cassian had been building toward for 2 years. She stayed at his left side as they moved toward the front of the gathering crowd. Around them, the room reshuffled in the particular way of people who wanted to be seen near the front without appearing to push. Dante had moved as well. She tracked him peripherally, watching him position himself about 12 feet to their right, and the specific location of that position told her everything she needed to know about his plan for the next 30 minutes. Close enough to watch, far enough to move. The executive director finished his remarks. Applause. The grant recipients were introduced. More applause. Then Cassian stepped to the podium, and the room settled into the attentive quiet that powerful rooms gave to powerful men. She watched Roland from across the crowd. He was watching Cassian. His face was doing the society function version of itself. Interested, supportive, the expression of a man who intended to be photographed in this room tonight. But beneath it, in the minute compression of the muscles around his eyes, she could see the calculation running. He knew something was wrong. He'd known before he walked in. That was why he was here. Cassian spoke about the Foundation's work with his customary controlled efficiency. 3 minutes, no excess. The kind of address that communicated he respected his audience's time. Then he paused. "Before we close the formal program," he said, "I'd like to share something that I believe is directly relevant to this city and to every person in this room who has a stake in how Chicago is governed." The room's temperature changed. She could feel it. The shift in the quality of the attention, the way people straightened fractionally in the way that people straighten when they understand something real is about to happen. She reached into her evening bag. Her fingers found the drive. She turned toward the AV technician stationed at the equipment table to her left. A Moretti employee, confirmed, cleared, Priya's contact, and she took the 2 steps toward him and placed the drive in his hand. And that was when the shooting started. The first shot came from the east side of the room. It was not the cracking sound of cinema gunfire. It was the flat, concussive industrial sound of an actual weapon discharged in an enclosed space, and it punched through the air of the ballroom, and the entire room became a different place in the same instant. What had been ordered and controlled and predictable exploded into chaos, with the specific total violence of a thing that had been coiled and waiting. Glass shattered somewhere to her right. The crowd collapsed inward and then outward simultaneously. People dropping to the floor, people running, people standing paralyzed for the fraction of a second before their bodies understood what was happening. Screams layered over each other into a wall of sound. Cassian had her arm. She didn't feel him grab it. She was just suddenly being moved, hard and fast, his grip on her upper arm not gentle, but not rough. The controlled force of a man who knew exactly how to move a person through chaos without injuring them. They were behind the marble staircase that curved up from the ballroom's northeast corner before she'd processed more than 2 seconds of it. She pressed her back against the cold stone. Cassian was directly in front of her, one hand still on her arm, his body angled to shield her while he assessed the room. The room was hell. 3 masked figures with rifles had come through the service corridor at the east wall. The corridor she'd noted on entry, the corridor that Priya's team was supposed to be covering. Cassian's security had returned fire, and the space between the ballroom's grand architecture and the reality of what was happening in it created a kind of insane visual dissonance. Crystal chandeliers, cream and gold walls, and muzzle flashes cutting through smoke that was beginning to fill the air from a table that had been knocked over onto a heating element. People were down. She could see 3 people down from here, and she couldn't tell whether they were hiding or hurt. "The drive," she said. "Forget the drive." "The AV technician?" "Forget it. We move." Cassian's eyes were moving across the room, not at her, tracking. "There's a service exit at the kitchen's north wall, 40 feet. We go now while their fire is directed at my security team." "Where's Roland?" "Seraphine, where is he?" She grabbed his arm. Cassian looked at her. 1 second. "East side. He was moving toward the service corridor before the shooting started." She processed that. Before the shooting started. He'd been moving toward the corridor before the guns came through it. "He knew exactly when," she said. "Yes." That means Dante told him the exact timing. The exact moment the documents would go up. "Yes. The drive is gone." Something crossed Cassian's face. A compression of pure controlled rage. The AV table was the first thing they went for. She looked at the table. It was overturned, equipment scattered, the technician down behind it. Not shot, she could see him moving, but the equipment was destroyed, wires torn, the laptop that would have connected to the projection system in pieces across the floor. The drive. She'd put the drive in his hand, and then the shooting started, and it had been 15 seconds, and she didn't know where it was, and without it, they had nothing. The financial records existed in backup, but the authentication, the chain of custody, the specific documented provenance that made it court viable rather than just damning. "We need to move," Cassian said. She pushed off the marble staircase. "I know." They moved. The kitchen was 38 feet of open floor, interrupted by toppled cocktail tables and the terrified, crouching bodies of catering staff and guests who'd had the spatial sense to get out of the main ballroom. Cassian moved through it with her close behind, and 2 of his security people materialized from nowhere to bracket them. She didn't know their names, she knew their faces from the building, and the competence with which they fell into position told her everything she needed to know about their training. The north service exit was a steel door set into the kitchen's far wall. One of the security men hit it with his shoulder and it swung into a concrete stairwell, industrial, lit by emergency fluorescents in wire cages, the smell of cooking oil and cold stone. They went down 2 flights before Cassian stopped. "Status," he said to the near security man. 3 shooters confirmed in the ballroom, possibly 4. Reeves' team engaged them at the corridor. "We have casualties, number unknown. The east elevator bank is compromised." "Where is Dante?" A pause that was a fraction too long. "Unknown." Cassian's jaw moved. Find him. Sir, find him. The man put his earpiece back in and began talking. Cassian turned to the other one. Car. Now. Ground level, south side. It's a 4-minute walk through the loading. I know how long it is. Go. The second man moved down the stairs ahead of them. Cassian turned to Seraphine. In the cold fluorescent light of the stairwell, he looked stripped. Whatever was left of the public-facing version of him had been taken by the last 3 minutes. What remained was the thing underneath, not the performance of controlled power, but actual controlled power, which was different in the way that a loaded weapon was different from a photograph of one. Are you hurt? He said. No. He looked at her for 1 second with an intensity that wasn't assessment. It was something else, something that didn't have a word for it in the context of a burning building and a plan in ruins. And then he turned and they followed the second security man down the remaining stairs. They were almost to the ground level when she heard the door above them open. Not the frantic slam of someone fleeing, the measured, controlled sound of someone who knew exactly which door they needed and was moving with purpose. She grabbed Cassian's arm. He stopped. The security man ahead of them stopped, weapon drawn. Footsteps on the stairs above. One person, coming down at a pace that was too deliberate for fear. Cassian looked up. Dante Reeve came around the stairwell's curve. He was in his evening wear, jacket slightly torn at the left shoulder, no weapon visible. His face was the same face it always was. The open, professional face she'd sat across from in meetings for 2 weeks. The face that had smiled at her over a glass of tap water and said, "He speaks well of you." And in this stairwell, stripped of every surrounding context, she could finally see the thing she'd been reading as a seam in the past 2 days for what it actually was. Not a crack in a mask, just the real face. She'd been right. The knowledge didn't feel like anything particular. It felt like confirmation. Cassian didn't say his name. He didn't say anything. He looked at Dante with an expression that she had never seen on him before and hoped she never would again. Not rage, past rage, something that had burned through rage and come out the other side of it as something colder and more permanent. And the air in the stairwell had the quality of a pressure system about to break. "I need you to hear me," Dante said. His voice was steady. She had to give him that. His voice didn't shake. "Before you do whatever you're going to do." "You have 30 seconds, Cassian said. "Roland has the drive." The words hit the stairwell and sat there. One of his men pulled it from the floor in the first 60 seconds. He has the documents, he has the drive, and he has a team of lawyers on call who will have the chain of custody dismantled before morning. Dante's eyes moved to Seraphine briefly. Not apology, not quite, but something adjacent to acknowledgement. "I'm sorry, that's not..." He stopped, recalibrated. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." "What was it supposed to go?" Cassian said. "It was supposed to stop you before you did something that would have started a war with 4 other organizations. Roland came to me 14 months ago with information about what would happen if you moved against him. The blowback, the alliances he has in place, the people who would come for this organization if you took him down without..." "Sal Benedetti," Cassian said. Dante stopped. "Marcus Webb." Cassian's voice hadn't risen. That was the worst of it, the absolute evenness of it. "You're going to stand in this stairwell and tell me it wasn't supposed to go this far, and I'm going to ask you about 2 men who are in the morgue tonight because they were getting close to you." Something moved through Dante's face, something real, for the first time since she'd known him. "I didn't order that." "Roland did." "Yes, with information you gave him." The silence was its own answer. Cassian took 1 step toward him, and Dante held his ground, which was either courage or the resignation of a man who had already decided how this ended, and Cassian stopped with 18 inches between them and looked at the man who had been at his side for 9 years. "Where is he taking her?" Cassian said. Seraphine's blood went cold. "What?" she said. Dante's eyes moved to her again. This time the thing in them was closer to what she'd expected. Not guilt, something more honest than guilt. The acknowledgement of a person who had been a tool for so long they'd stopped distinguishing between their will and the hand that held them. "The ballroom was a distraction," Dante said. "The drive was secondary. You were always the primary target tonight." He was looking at her, not at Cassian, at her. Roland's known for 3 weeks that you've been working with Cassian's investigators, that you have records he can't account for, things you memorized, things that aren't on any drive. He paused. He needs you to tell him what you remember, what you know that isn't documented. He can rebuild around documented evidence. He can't rebuild around a witness who carries the architecture of his operation in her head. The stairwell was very quiet. She thought about the ballroom, the choreography of it, the timing, the specific positioning, the way it had been designed to separate her from Cassian in the chaos. She thought about Roland moving toward the service corridor before the shot started. She thought about the car. "He's not gone," she said. "No," Dante said. "He's still in the building. The loading dock, south side." Dante looked at Cassian. "There's a team waiting, 5 men. He was going to let you get to the car and then—" Cassian was already moving. She started after him and Dante caught her arm. Not hard, but she felt it, and her whole body went electric with the response. That full system animal alarm that years in Roland's house had burned into her, and her elbow came back and connected with his forearm, hard enough to break the grip before she'd decided to do it. Dante stepped back. He looked at his arm. He looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said again. Still steady. Still that infuriating control. She looked at him for 1 second. "No," she said. "You're not. You're just done." She turned and followed Cassian. The loading dock was below grade, a wide concrete platform accessible through 2 roll-up doors that opened onto a service alley on the building's south face. The security man who'd gone ahead of them was down at the base of the final staircase, pressed against the wall with his weapon up, and he held up 4 fingers when he saw them and pointed toward the dock doors. 4 men visible. Roland inside. Cassian took the weapon from the second security man, a clean transfer, no hesitation, and moved to the wall beside the first man. He looked back at her. "Stay here," he said. "No. Seraphine, he has men. You need eyes on the angles." She met his look directly. "I've been in worse rooms with that man than a loading dock. I know how he moves." His jaw tightened. 1 second. Then, "You stay behind the concrete pillar. You don't move into open floor, no matter what you hear." "Okay. Say it back." "Behind the pillar. I don't move." He held her gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned to the door. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not what she'd expected, which was naive of her. She had never actually been in the physical reality of this kind of violence, only its aftermath and its architecture and its consequences. The reality was faster and louder and less legible than anything she'd prepared herself for. Shouted commands, the concussive report of weapons in an enclosed concrete space that made her ears ring immediately, the sounds of impact and movement and men's voices at frequencies she didn't have words for. She pressed her back against the concrete pillar exactly as she'd said she would. She did not move. She heard Roland's voice once, just briefly, over the other sounds, giving a command in the clipped authority of a man who expected to be obeyed. And hearing it did something to her chest that she breathed through deliberately, counting, keeping her body on her side. Then, silence. Not the silence of resolution, the silence of a pause. She came around the pillar. The dock was a wreckage of overturned equipment pallets and shattered fluorescent light fixtures. 2 of Roland's men down. The other 2 retreated to the far end near the roll-up door. Cassian's 2 security men had them in position. Cassian himself was 12 feet from her, his arm extended, the gun in his hand pointed at empty space. He was pointing at empty space. The roll-up door behind the 2 remaining men was half open, raised from outside, and through the gap she could see the service alley's wet pavement and the dim glow of the street beyond. "Where is he?" she said. The security man nearest her turned. His face told her before his words did. "He got through the door during the exchange. There's a vehicle—" "He's gone," Cassian said. His voice was flat, entirely flat. "He had an exit vehicle and he was gone before we cleared the first 2. She stood in the loading dock with the smell of gun smoke and wet concrete, and she understood what that meant in its full dimension. The drive was gone. Roland was gone. The evidence chain was broken, and the man who had built a trafficking empire on the bones of women like her was at this moment in a vehicle moving away from this building through the streets of a city that didn't know what had just happened. Cassian lowered the gun. She looked at his profile and saw what she'd seen in the stairwell. That place past rage. And then she looked at the half-open roll-up door in the wet alley beyond it, and she felt something move through her that she didn't have a word for, something that was composed of all of it. The 2 years of waiting, the 4 years before that, the scars under her clothes, the women she'd never met who'd moved through Roland's network and come out somewhere worse than where they'd started or not come out at all. And it moved through her and settled at the bottom of her chest like ballast. She was not going to fall apart. She was not going to stand in a loading dock and collapse into what this felt like. She was going to think. The backup records, she said. Her voice was steady. She was somewhat amazed by how steady it was. The authenticated copies Priya was building outside Dante's access radius. Tell me those still exist. Cassian turned to look at her. They exist, he said. Where? Secured server. Off-site. Nothing from tonight touched it. Then we're not finished. She held his gaze. The drive was one path. It was the cleanest path. It's gone now. But a case built on backup authentication and witness testimony takes months, years, if Roland's lawyers go to work. Maybe. She looked at the open door, at the rain-wet alley. Or maybe we don't try to do it the clean way. He was watching her now with an expression she recognized. The expression he used when she'd said something that recalibrated his picture of the situation. He'll run, she said. Tonight. The plan was to take the drive and disappear. Now he has the drive, but we know he has it, which means he knows the timeline is compressed. He needs to be out of the country before the backup authentication reaches anyone who can act on it. She paused. There's one place he goes first, before he runs. There always is. How do you know that? Because I know him. She looked at Cassian directly. He has a property outside the city, not on record under his name. It's under 3 layers of holding company, none of which connect to Roland Vane in any visible way. I know what it is. I know what happens there. Her voice stayed level and cold and precise. He'll go there to retrieve one specific thing before he runs. Physical records. His insurance policy against every powerful man who's ever used his network. Names, dates, documentation. He keeps it there because it's the one thing he's never trusted to any electronic system. Cassian was absolutely still. If we get there before he leaves, she said, we don't need the drive. We don't need the chain of custody. We have physical documentation that connects every name on that list to what they paid for, and that is not something any lawyer dismantles, because the men on that list would rather burn Roland themselves than let their names reach a federal prosecutor. The loading dock was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city and the soft percussion of rain on the alley pavement outside. You've known about this place the whole time, Cassian said. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? She looked at him. It was a fair question. The answer was the one she'd been carrying since before the wedding, since before any of this, since the moment she understood that telling anyone everything at once was how you ended up with no leverage and no options and no way out. Because if tonight had gone perfectly, she said, I would never have needed to use it. It was the last card. She paused. Tonight didn't go perfectly. He held her gaze. The property, he said. How far? 40 minutes, northwest of the city. A place called Blackthorn Manor. Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly, more like the terrible click of recognition, the sound of a thing that had always been there finally becoming visible. I know that property, he said. I know you do. She kept her voice even. Women went in there, Cassian, over the years. They went in, and they didn't all come out, and the ones who did came out somewhere they never expected to be. She held his gaze, and she did not let it waver. I need to be there when we take him, not because I want vengeance, because there are things in that building that will only mean anything if someone who understands what they are is present to say so. Someone who can stand in front of a prosecutor and explain exactly what they're looking at. She could feel the argument forming in him, the protective instinct that she'd watched develop over the past 2 weeks, the specific version of it that was both genuine and, at moments, infuriating in its assumption that protection was something you did to a person rather than with them. She spoke before he could. You told me, she said carefully, that your word has kept this organization alive for 14 years. Yes. Then keep your word. You said you'd keep me alive. You didn't say you'd keep me in the car. She looked at him steadily. I've been moving toward that building since I was 17 years old. I am going through its doors tonight. The rain moved against the alley pavement. Cassian looked at her for a long moment, not assessing, not calculating, something else. And she saw in his face the thing she'd first seen at 4 a.m. in the hallway, the thing that was past the performance of who he was and into the territory of who he actually was, which was a man who understood the specific weight of a promise made to someone who had never had enough of them kept. Then we go, he said. She exhaled. We go, she said. The convoy left the city at 11:47. 3 vehicles, 2 armored SUVs and a sedan running interference, moving northwest through rain-soaked streets that were still busy enough to swallow them without comment. Seraphine sat in the back of the lead SUV with Cassian on her left and a man named Ortega on her right. Ortega, who she'd seen twice in the building's elevator, and who held his weapon with the casual economy of someone who had been in too many bad rooms to perform tenseness about it anymore. She had changed in the parking structure below the Meridian. One of the female security staff had produced dark trousers, flat-soled boots, a plain black jacket that fit well enough. She'd stripped the burgundy dress off in the back of the SUV without ceremony while they were still underground, and the security woman had looked straight ahead the entire time, which Seraphine appreciated. The drive was 40 minutes if the roads were clean. In the SUV's quiet, with the rain on the windows and the city giving way to the dark arterials of the outer northwest. She ran through it again. The layout of Blackthorn Manor as she knew it, the approaches, the interior she'd only seen twice, both times as a teenager, both times in circumstances she had filed away with the specific archival precision of someone who understood that memory was the only form of evidence nobody could take from her. The iron gate at the property's entrance. The circular drive. The main building's 3 occupied floors and the sublevel that didn't appear on any property record she'd ever been able to find. The sublevel was where he kept the physical documentation. It was also, she was fairly certain, where he would be heading first. Tell me the layout, Cassian said. Not loud, not urgent, the operational tone. She told him. She told him everything she remembered with the same systematic precision she'd used with the investigators, describing the approach road, the gatekeeper structure, the main building's ground floor, the staircase configuration, and then the basement access, a door behind a false wall panel in what had been a storage room at the building's east end. She'd found it at 17 by accident, a loose panel she'd leaned against in the dark during one of the nights she'd been left alone in the building while Roland entertained downstairs, and she'd understood immediately that she was looking at something she was not supposed to find, and she had memorized every detail of the access mechanism and said nothing for 7 years. When she finished, the SUV was quiet for a moment. You've been carrying that since you were 17, Ortega said. Not a question. Yes, she said. He didn't say anything else. The respect in it was in the silence. Cassian looked at her. In the dark interior of the vehicle, his face was mostly shadow, but she could see the line of his jaw. The set of it, and the particular quality of his attention toward her that she had come to understand as distinct from every other quality of attention he directed at things. Not the assessing look, not the operational calculation, something that lived in the same territory as what had happened between them at 4 a.m. in the hallway, and had been building since, the thing neither of them had named because naming it was a risk they couldn't price in the middle of everything else. She looked away from him. How many men does he typically run at the property? Cassian said. When I was there as a teenager, 6. Standing security, 2 at the gate, 2 rotating the perimeter, 2 inside. But that was 8 years ago, and he's been paranoid since I married you. She paused. Double it and plan for more. 12 minimum. Yes. We have 9. 9 plus us, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. He turned to the front. 9 plus us, he confirmed. Tamawamo. Blackthorn Manor appeared out of the dark at 12:41. A black iron gate set into a stone wall that ran the length of the property's road frontage, and beyond it the drive curving up through a stand of mature oaks whose bare branches caught the rain and the distant light from the house's upper windows. The gate was closed. There was a guard structure to the left. The convoy stopped 200 meters short. Cassian moved from the SUV fast and low, and Seraphine was right behind him before Ortega could get out first. She heard him exhale, the sound of a man deciding not to argue, and then he was beside her, and the 9 of them were moving through the wet dark along the stone wall toward the gate, with the rain on their backs and the sound of their own boots in the soaked grass. The gate guard didn't have time to make a sound. She didn't watch that part. She moved past it and through the open gate and up the drive with her eyes on the house. Blackthorn Manor was not what its name implied. It wasn't Gothic or dramatic. It was large and Georgian and set into the property with the settled authority of a building that had been expensive for a very long time. The lights in the upper windows told her the 3rd floor was occupied. The ground floor was dark except for the east wing, which burned with the particular flat brightness of fluorescent light through a covered window. The sublevel access was in the east wing. "He's already down there," she said. Cassian was beside her, "or his people are retrieving it for him." "No, he doesn't let anyone else handle it. That's the point of physical records. No chain, no exposure, no one who can be compelled to testify about what they touched." She kept her voice low. "He goes himself." Cassian looked at the house. He looked at Ortega. "Perimeter first. I want the upper floors cleared before we go near the basement access. If he hears us above him and there's a secondary exit—" "There isn't," she said. "There's one way in and one way out. He built it that way deliberately." "You're certain?" "I'm certain. Then upper floors and ground floor simultaneously. We take the exterior first." He turned to Ortega. "Split the team. 4 on the exterior, 2 on upper floors, 2 on ground. You and I take the east wing." "And her," Ortega said. Cassian looked at her. She looked at him. "She's with me," he said. The next 11 minutes were the longest and most terrible minutes she had experienced since the Vale estate, which she would not have predicted an hour ago. The exterior team moved in a pattern she couldn't fully track from the east wing approach. She heard it in fragments, voices through Cassian's earpiece that she caught the edges of, the specific sounds of encounters that she had no visual reference for and had to file away without letting the gaps in her information pull her attention from what was immediately in front of her. What was immediately in front of her was the east wing door, which one of Cassian's men opened in 30 seconds with tools she hadn't seen him produce, and the interior hallway beyond it, stone-floored, fluorescent lit, smelling of bleach and cold air, and the faint underlayer of something she couldn't name, but her body named for her, every hair on her arms lifting under her jacket sleeves. She had been in this hallway once, 8 years ago. She had been 19 that time, not 17, and she had come to this wing following sounds she'd heard from above, and she'd stood in this exact corridor and seen the door at the end of it. And she had not been able to make herself go further because she was 19 and alone and had no power and no allies and no weapon except the thing she was storing in her memory. She walked down the hallway now. Her boots were silent on the stone. Cassian was 2 steps ahead of her, and Ortega was behind her, and one more man was behind him, and the hallway was 30 feet, and then a sharp right, and then the storage room. The storage room door was open. The light inside it was on. Cassian stopped at the door jamb. She stopped beside him. They looked into the storage room. Industrial shelving, cardboard file boxes, a concrete floor with a drain at its center, and the false wall panel was open, swung outward on a hinged mechanism, revealing the concrete staircase beyond it descending into light. Voices below. 2 of them. One was Roland's. Cassian's hand came up, flat palm, hold position. He turned to Ortega and communicated something with his eyes that she didn't have the language for, and Ortega nodded and moved to a different position in the room, and then Cassian looked at her. She pointed down. He held her gaze for 1 second. She pointed down again. He turned and went through the panel. The sublevel was a single room, 15 by 20 feet, with a ceiling low enough that Cassian had to angle his head slightly as he moved through the doorway. It was lit by 2 bare bulbs on a central fixture, and the walls were lined with metal shelving units holding labeled binders and archival boxes that were themselves labeled with a system of dates and codes that she recognized. She had never seen the contents, but she had understood the filing system from the brief glimpse she'd gotten at 19, and seeing it here now, fully real, sent a current through her that she managed by breathing. Roland was at the far end of the room. He had a large aluminum case open on the central work table and was transferring binders into it. Not rushed, but efficient. The controlled efficiency of a man who had planned this contingency and was executing it. His back was to the staircase. Beside him stood a single man. Bodyguard, big, positioned between Roland and the door with the awareness of someone whose only job was the awareness. The bodyguard saw them first. What happened in the next 45 seconds was chaos compressed into its most essential form. The bodyguard moved, and Cassian moved, and the aluminum case went sideways off the table, and binders slid across the concrete floor, and the bodyguard's weapon discharged once into the ceiling before Ortega was on him, and the sound in that enclosed concrete space was physical. A pressure wave that hit Seraphine in the chest and left her ears ringing. She didn't freeze. She moved to the table. The aluminum case was on the floor, contents partially spilled. She went to her knees and began pulling binders toward her, checking labels with her fingers, sorting by the date system she recognized. Behind her, she heard Roland's voice. "Seraphine." She didn't turn around. "I'd like you to stand up," he said. She continued sorting. Her hands were absolutely steady. Later she would marvel at that, at the specific quality of her own steadiness in that room, in front of that voice. She had spent years shaking in that voice's presence. She did not shake now. "Stand up," Roland said again. And this time there was the flat sound of a weapon being cocked. And she heard Cassian's voice say something low and deliberate. And she understood from the quality of it that the situation had reconfigured while she was sorting binders, and she needed to look at it now. She stood up. She turned around. Roland had a gun. It was pointed at Cassian, who was 8 feet from him with his own weapon raised, and the two of them were positioned in the geometry of a standoff, balanced, neither able to move without the other having a clear moment of advantage. Ortega was against the far wall with his weapon trained on Roland, but Roland had positioned himself with the shelving unit partially at his back, and the angle made a clean shot complicated. She looked at Roland. He had aged since the last time she'd seen him, which was not something she had expected to notice, and definitely not something she had expected to feel anything about, but she noticed it. The additional lines in his face, the gray that had finished taking over his temples. He was still large, still carried himself with the absolute certainty of authority, and his eyes, when they moved to her, were the same eyes they had always been. Not cruel, not sadistic in any obvious way, which was the most disturbing thing about him. They were the eyes of a man who had simply categorized certain things as permissible and had never revisited that categorization. "Put it down," he said to Cassian. Conversational, as if they were at a function. "You're out of position and you know it." "So are you," Cassian said. "I have a car 90 seconds from this building. My men have already cleared your perimeter team." He said it without satisfaction, just informational. "You came with 9. I made a call 20 minutes ago. There are 14 between this room and the gate." Seraphine looked at Cassian. She could see him processing it, weighing it, and she knew what he was calculating because she was calculating it too. Whether the perimeter report was real or bluff, what the actual status of the exterior team was, whether the 9 seconds it would take Roland to reach the staircase were 9 seconds Ortega could work with from his current angle. "Your network is already dismantled," she said. Roland's eyes moved to her. "Not the evidence from tonight," she said. "The documentation we've been building for 3 months, the authenticated records that have nothing to do with that drive." She kept her voice steady, direct, exactly the tone she used in conference rooms. "Federal prosecutors have a preliminary file. It doesn't need tonight's evidence to begin. It just needs time, and you running means time is the one thing you're giving them." Something moved through his face. A compression, rapidly controlled. "You're bluffing," he said. "Think about whether you believe that." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see it. Not uncertainty exactly, but the first crack in the absolute authority. The first moment of having to actually assess rather than assume. Roland Vane had spent a lifetime in rooms where he held every variable. He was not comfortable with the experience of not knowing. "You were always smarter than I gave you credit for," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an autopsy finding. "Yes," she said, "I was." "You survived me," he said. "I'll give you that. I was certain you wouldn't. A few times I was very certain." The room was absolutely silent, except for the sound of rain somewhere above them, filtering through the building's old bones. The bare bulbs buzzed their slight buzz. On the floor between them, the binders she'd been pulling, 8 years of his insurance policy, every name, every transaction, every protected man who had bought what he was selling, were spread across the concrete. "The women," she said, "the ones who came through this building." His face didn't change. "Where are they?" she said. "That's not a question I'm going to answer tonight." "You're going to answer it," she said. "Not tonight, maybe, but you're going to answer it because the information in those binders, the information on those men, is the thing that guarantees your survival once you're in custody. You have nothing else to bargain with, not anymore." She held his gaze. "So you're going to tell prosecutors everything you know about where those women went, and you're going to do it because it's the only card left in your hand, and the only way that card is worth anything is if you're alive to play it." Something moved through Roland's face that she couldn't fully name. Not remorse. She didn't think he had the architecture for remorse, had never thought that. It would have been almost easier if he had. It was something more like the recognition of a person who has reached the terminal point of their own plan and is having to revision what comes after. His gun hand was still raised. Cassian had not moved. "Put it down, Roland," she said. Not a plea, not a command, just the flat, tired, certain voice of a woman who had been waiting 8 years for this exact moment and was not going to let it resolve in a basement with a gun going off. Roland looked at her. Then he looked at Cassian. Then, and it happened so fast she almost missed the wind-up. He swung the gun sideways and fired. The shot caught Cassian in the left shoulder. The impact took him back and sideways into the metal shelving, and the shelving went over with a crash that shook the room, and Cassian went down with it. And Seraphine heard herself make a sound she'd never made before. Something that came from the center of her chest, not a scream, lower and more animal than a scream. Ortega fired. The shot hit Roland in the right forearm, and he dropped the gun, and the sound he made was not the sound of a powerful man. It was just the sound of pain, immediate and human and without dignity. Roland went to his knees beside the upended shelving unit. Seraphine was already across the room. Cassian was on the floor against the overturned shelving, his left hand pressed to his shoulder, dark spreading through the fabric of his jacket. He was conscious. His eyes were open, and when she dropped to her knees beside him, they found her face immediately with the specific focus of someone in pain who is managing the pain rather than being managed by it. "How bad?" she said. "Went through," he said. His voice was tight. "No." He stopped, breathed. "No major structure. Went through." She pulled the jacket back from the wound with hands that did not shake and looked at it. And he was right. It was bad, and bleeding badly, but the entry and exit were clean and nothing in the wound's presentation suggested arterial involvement. She stripped her outer jacket off and pressed it against the exit wound and took his hand and pressed it over the jacket. "Hold this," she said. "I know how to hold—" "Hold it," she said. "Hard. Don't lecture me." His jaw tightened, with pain or something else she couldn't tell, and he pressed hard. She looked at Ortega. "Call it in," she said. "Medical, police, federal contacts, everything, now." "Already in progress," Ortega said. He was standing over Roland, who was on the floor with his injured arm held against his chest, and Roland was looking up at Ortega with the expression of a man who has arrived at a destination he spent years pretending did not exist at the end of his road. She turned back to Cassian. He was looking at her, just looking at her, with the pain doing its thing in his face, and underneath the pain something else. The same thing from the hallway, from the window at 4 in the morning, from the moment in the loading dock when he'd said, "She's with me." And she was aware that they were on the floor of a concrete sublevel in a property that smelled of decades of terrible things, and that was not the location she would have chosen for this, any of this, but here they were. "You're going to be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "The shoulder will—" "Seraphine." His voice was quiet, tight with pain but quiet. "Stop." She stopped. "You were right," he said. "About all of it. The last card. Coming here." He paused to breathe. "About everything." She looked at him. Her hands were pressed against his shoulder, and there was blood on her fingers, and the room smelled the way it smelled, and 40 feet above them it was raining on the roof of Blackthorn Manor, and none of that was what she was aware of. She was aware of his face. We got him, she said. Yes. The binders. I see them. They're enough. They're more than enough. Every name, I know. Every transaction, every... Seraphine. His right hand came up, unsteady. She could feel the effort of it. And his fingers found her wrist, covered in blood from his shoulder, and held it. Not hard, just held it. Stop cataloging. She looked at him. He stopped. Breathed through something. Just stay here for a minute. She looked at his face, at the pain in it, and the thing behind the pain that she had been watching develop for 2 weeks and had not let herself name, because naming things too early was how you broke them, and she had broken enough things by rushing them, and she had promised herself she would not do that again. She stayed. Above them, through the building's old bones, she could hear distant sirens. The first of them, and then more, converging through the wet dark from the direction of the city. It was over. It was almost over. There was still one thing remaining, one thing she had known since she was 17 years old, and had been carrying every day since. The thing that had kept her upright through 4 years in that house, and 2 years of planning and 3 weeks of impossible marriage. And this night, this specific terrible night. Roland Vane was 10 feet from her on the floor of his own sublevel, injured and contained and out of options, and he was going to answer for every single thing he had done, and she was going to be in the room when he did. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Cassian was bleeding on a concrete floor and holding her wrist with his good hand and asking her to stop cataloging, and she pressed her hands harder against his shoulder, and she stayed exactly where she was, and she breathed, and outside the sirens got louder, and the rain came down on Blackthorn Manor like it was trying to wash the whole property clean, and the binders with their 8 years of names and dates and transactions were spread across the floor between her and the only man in Chicago who had given her his word and actually kept it. She looked at Roland. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ceiling, at the bare concrete ceiling of the room he had built to hold his secrets, finally become the room that held him instead. She looked back at Cassian. His eyes were still open, still on her face. Still here, she said. I know, he said. The sirens were outside the gate now. She could hear the specific sound of multiple vehicles moving up the gravel drive, the crackle of radio communication, voices calling coordinates to each other in the wet dark. She heard Ortega on the phone, precise and clear, directing the medical team to the sublevel access. She heard Roland make a sound, just a small sound, not pain, not fear exactly, more like a man making the sound of a door closing, and she did not look at him again. She pressed her hands against Cassian's shoulder, and the sirens were here, and the footsteps were on the stairs, and the room was full of voices and light, and she held on and held on and held. The paramedics came down the stairs at 12:59 in the morning with a stretcher and a kit, and the particular efficient urgency of people who had been told gunshot wound sublevel and had moved accordingly. Seraphine didn't get out of their way immediately. She stayed with her hands pressed to Cassian's shoulder until the lead paramedic, a woman with close-cropped hair and calm brown eyes, put her own gloved hands over Seraphine's and said, quietly, I have him. You can let go now. She let go. Her hands came away dark. She looked at them for a moment, the specific fact of his blood on her fingers, the warmth of it already cooling in the basement air, and then she stood up and stepped back and let the paramedics work. Cassian didn't take his eyes off her while they worked on him. She didn't look away either. Across the room, 2 federal agents she didn't recognize had Roland Vane on his feet, his injured arm treated and bound, his face composed into the particular blankness of a man who had decided that the version of this story that served him best was the one where he said nothing at all until he had lawyers present. He was good at that face. She had watched him wear it at Vale Estate functions for years, at press events, at the kind of dinners where everyone present understood that certain things were not spoken about, and it had always been effective because the people looking at it wanted to believe what it presented. The agents looking at him now didn't want to believe anything. They looked at him the way people looked at something they intended to take apart thoroughly. When Roland was moved toward the stairs, he passed within 6 feet of her. He didn't look at her. She had thought for years about what this moment would feel like. The moment of his arrest, his containment, the final collapse of the thing he had built and hidden behind the Vale family name, and his political aspirations and his careful maintenance of the face that convinced everyone around him. She had imagined it as something enormous, something that would hit her like weather. What it actually felt like was a door closing. Not dramatic, not cathartic in the way she'd expected. Just the specific physical sensation of a thing that had been open for 8 years finally moving shut. A draft disappearing, a pressure equalizing, the room becoming a slightly different temperature. She watched him go up the stairs. She exhaled through her nose. Then she turned back to Cassian. The hospital was Northwestern Memorial, and they took him into surgery at 2:15 in the morning for a procedure that the attending surgeon, a precise and unhurried man named Dr. Okafor, described to her as straightforward. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing bone and major vessels, and the primary work was cleaning the wound track and managing the tissue damage. He said it would take approximately 90 minutes. She sat in a waiting room that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and recycled air. Ortega sat across from her with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, and Priya arrived 20 minutes after they did with a laptop and 2 federal contacts who needed to talk to Seraphine about the sublevel's contents and the chain of custody for the binders. She talked to them for 45 minutes. She was precise and thorough, and she answered every question with the same methodical clarity she'd brought to every conversation about Roland's operation for the past 3 weeks. And when they left, she sat back in the plastic hospital chair and felt the exhaustion arrive. Not the dramatic exhaustion of sudden collapse, but the bone-deep, cellular exhaustion of a body that had been running on adrenaline and purpose for months, and had just received the signal that it was allowed to stop now. She didn't sleep. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and she let herself feel it. All of it. The parts she'd been managing and compartmentalizing and setting aside because the next thing needed her attention. She let the feeling of the sublevel sit in her chest without trying to process it into something useful. She let the memory of Roland's face as the agents moved him toward the stairs exist without analyzing it. She let the image of Cassian on the concrete floor, hand around her wrist, eyes on her face. She let that one exist without naming it. She let herself be a person sitting in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning instead of a woman executing a plan. It was harder than she expected. Priya sat beside her at some point, she wasn't sure when, and didn't say anything, which was exactly right, and Seraphine was grateful for it in a way she didn't know how to express without it sounding inadequate. At 4:07, Dr. Okafor came into the waiting room and told her the surgery was complete, that the patient was stable and in recovery, and that she could see him in approximately 40 minutes. She nodded. She said thank you. She sat back down. They let her in at 4:52. The recovery room was a private space. Ortega had handled that, though she hadn't asked him to, with the soft, persistent sounds of medical monitoring equipment and the lowered lighting of a room designed to allow rest. Cassian was on the bed with his left arm immobilized and an IV line in his right wrist, and he was awake. She could tell he'd been awake for a while. His eyes found her the moment she came through the door, and they held the quality of someone who had been lying in a quiet room with nothing to do but think, and who had been thinking. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. "How bad is the pain?" she said. "Managed?" His voice was rougher than usual. Residual anesthesia, she thought, or the specific rawness of a night like this one. "Don't fuss." "I'm not fussing, I'm asking a factual question." Managed is a factual answer. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, the monitors kept their soft time. "Roland is in federal custody," she said. "The binders are in evidence. Priya's contacts confirmed they are." Her word was comprehensive. Every name, every transaction, dates going back 11 years. She paused. 11 years, Cassian. That's how long he documented it. His own insurance policy against every man he'd ever provided a service to. He built leverage on everyone who ever used him, Cassian said. It was his real business. The network was one income stream. The documentation was power. She looked at her hands, which were clean now, but whose ghost she could still feel. He thought it was protection. In the end, it's everything a prosecutor needs to dismantle not just him, but every person who enabled him. Cassian was quiet for a moment. The alderman, Cartwright. His name is in the binders. The federal judges. 2 of them. Yes. Another pause. Your father, he said carefully. She had been waiting for this. The documentation covers the years Roland was running the network, she said. My father died before Roland fully systematized it. His involvement was, it's more complicated than I understood. She stopped, organized what she wanted to say. My father was not innocent. I stopped believing that when I was about 20. He knew things. He looked away from things. The business arrangements he had with Roland were, he had to have known, at some level, what Roland was. She looked at the wall. But the documentation in those binders ends before the period of what Roland did specifically to me. And I have spent a long time trying to figure out whether my father would have... She stopped again. You don't have to figure that out tonight, Cassian said. I know. She brought her eyes back to him. I'm not sure I ever have to figure it out. Some questions don't have clean answers, and making peace with that is its own kind of resolution. He looked at her steadily. Is that what you actually believe, or is that what you've decided to believe? It was the kind of question she'd come to expect from him, the one that went straight past the presentable answer to the question behind it. She thought about it honestly. Both, she said finally. In my experience, those are often the same thing. Something in his face, not quite a smile, the quality of one, the particular softening that she'd learned to read as his version of it. Dante, she said. The softening went away. He's gone, Cassian said. He ran from the stairwell. We don't have him yet. You will. Yes. The word was quiet and flat, and she understood what it contained. Cassian. She held his gaze. Whatever you decide to do with Dante, that's not something I'm going to speak to. That's yours. She paused. But whatever you decide it because it serves something, not just because of how much it hurts. He looked at her for a long time. 9 years, he said. I know. He was at... I know. She didn't say anything else. She just let him have it, the full weight of it, without trying to ease it into something smaller or more manageable than it was. Some things needed their full size for a while. He turned his head toward the window. Outside, Chicago was doing the last part of its night, that particular stillness of the hours between 4 and 6 when the city had finished with the previous day and hadn't begun the next one. My mother's funeral, he said. She said nothing. He gave the eulogy. His jaw moved. He stopped. He was the only person outside my immediate organization who I had ever trusted with information about the things that mattered to me. Not operationally, personally. He turned back to look at her. I don't have a long list of those people. I know. I don't think you do, actually. I think you understand it intellectually, and I don't think you know it the way I know it because you haven't seen the list I have, the length of it. She looked at him. He looked back. Tell me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She thought he wouldn't. He was not a person who spoke about himself without strong reason, and the specific vulnerability of a recovery room bed at 5 in the morning was exactly the kind of condition that would put his defenses up rather than lower them. But he said, my father left when I was 8. Not left, he was removed. He was in my organization's predecessor, and he did something that meant he could not stay. My mother never told me what it was, and I found out when I was 22, and I wish I hadn't found out, because it was worse than anything I had invented for it. He paused. My mother ran a dry cleaning business on the north side for 18 years. She knew what I was building. She never said don't. She never said I'm afraid. She said, this is what she said. She said, whatever you make sure it can stand up without you holding it. Make something that lasts. He stopped. She died 3 years ago. Dante gave the eulogy because I asked him to, because he had known her for 6 years, and I thought he was, the closest thing to a friend I had built inside the life I had built. The room was quiet. He was your Sal Benedetti, Seraphine said. Cassian looked at her. But worse, she said, because Sal and Marcus were taken from you by someone else's decision. Dante was taken by his own. Something moved through his face. Something she hadn't seen before, something that lived beneath all the controlled layers, the operational surface, the patient architecture of a man who had decided early that efficiency was the appropriate response to pain. Something raw and human and not managed at all. He didn't say anything. She reached out and put her hand over his, the one with the IV line, careful of the placement. And she held it, and she didn't say anything either, because there was nothing useful to say, and she had learned long ago that the impulse to fill a painful silence with words was about the discomfort of the person doing the filling, not the comfort of the person you were filling it for. They sat like that for a while. The monitors kept their soft time. Outside, Chicago moved toward its next morning. 3 days later, they let him come home. He walked into the penthouse under his own power, which he had been adamant about since the second day. And she had not argued, and Ortega had not argued, and the two members of the medical team who had been brought in for the recovery period had watched him stand up from the hospital bed and set their faces into the expressions of professionals who had learned to make their peace with difficult patients. She was in the kitchen when he came through the door. She heard the elevator, heard Ortega's voice, and then the specific sound of Cassian's footsteps. She had learned them, apparently, at some point during the 3 weeks before the gala without being conscious of learning them, and she poured a second coffee and set it at the end of the counter. He came into the kitchen. He saw the coffee. He sat down. She leaned against the counter across from him with her own cup, and they looked at each other in the morning light of the penthouse, the city below the windows in its ordinary weekday motion, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "How is it?" she said. "Fine." "The pain?" I said fine. "You said managed in the hospital, and we established that managed is a factual answer. Fine is not a factual answer. Fine is a deflection." He looked at her with the look that was now familiar, the look that meant she'd said something that had caught him slightly off guard by being more direct than he'd accounted for. She had come to understand that he found this quality in her simultaneously disruptive, and she thought, something he valued in a way he hadn't yet fully admitted to himself. "It's a 4 on a 10-point scale," he said. "In the morning, lower by afternoon." "Okay," she said, that's a factual answer." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. "Priya called this morning," she said. "The federal prosecutor handling the Roland case has requested an initial interview. She said they want me in the room for it." "I know. She called me too. I told her I'd do it. I know that too." She looked at him. "You knew before you walked in here." "I checked my messages." "And you weren't going to say anything." "I was going to say something." He set the coffee cup down. "I was going to ask you if you were prepared for what that interview involves, what they're going to ask about, the specifics of what you experienced in the Vale estate, what you witnessed, what was done." He held her gaze. "They're going to need you to go through all of it in precise detail for the record, and I know you know that, and I know you're capable of it. I was going to ask if you wanted to talk through it before you walked into that room." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." He nodded once. "Not today," he said. "You just drove me home from the hospital. Today we—" He paused, and she watched him search for a word that was not native to his usual vocabulary. "Today we rest. Tomorrow we prepare." She looked at the city below the windows. The river was visible from this angle in winter, the water dark between its banks, the bridges carrying their traffic, the buildings on either side of it doing their ordinary business in the ordinary morning. "Okay," she said. They finished their coffee. The interview with the federal prosecutor took place 8 days after Roland's arrest, in a building downtown that smelled of carpet cleaner and document storage, in a conference room with a recorded session and 2 attorneys and a victim's advocate named Sandra, who sat quietly through the entire proceeding and whose presence Seraphine had found, to her own surprise, genuinely steadying. She went through it all. She went through it with the same systematic precision she had brought to every other part of this. And when the precision wasn't enough, when the prosecutor asked her to specify the events of a particular night in the Vale estate during her 19th year, and the precision broke down into something more jagged, something that had texture and temperature rather than just sequence, she breathed through it and continued, and Sandra's presence in her peripheral vision was steady and quiet, and she continued. Cassian was outside the room. He hadn't pushed to be present. He had understood without being told that this was a room she needed to be in alone, without the weight of his reaction to manage alongside her own. He had driven her there, and he was outside in the hallway when she came out 2 hours and 15 minutes later, sitting in one of the corridor chairs with his jacket off, and his good arm resting on the armrest, reading something on his phone. He looked up when she came through the door. She sat down in the chair beside him. They sat in the corridor of the federal building for a while without saying anything. How? He said. Done, she said. He looked at her. She looked at the wall. There was a moment, she said, about 40 minutes in, where I thought I couldn't keep the factual register, where the thing I was describing was going to pull me into the feeling of it, and I wasn't going to be able to stay technical. She paused. But I did. How? I thought about what the words were going to do. Not what they cost me to say, what they were going to build, once they were in the record. Each sentence going into a file that would go to a grand jury that would take apart everything Roland constructed. She turned to look at Cassian. The women in his network, most of them I'll never know. Most of what happened to them I'll never have specific knowledge of. But what I put in that room today is the architecture of how it was done and who enabled it and what they paid for. That's something real. That exists now, and I put it there. Cassian was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. You did. She looked at him. He looked back. Thank you, she said. He looked slightly thrown, which was an expression she had seen on him perhaps twice. For what? For keeping your word. She held his gaze. For the real kind of protection, not the other kind. He held her gaze for a moment longer than most people were comfortable holding a gaze. Then he said, You kept mine. What? When I was on the floor of that basement, he said it plainly. You kept your hands on my shoulder and you didn't run and you stayed. He paused. That's not a small thing, in my experience. She looked at him. No, she said. It isn't. Pulse. 6 weeks after the arrest, Dante Reeve was found in a motel outside Indianapolis by 2 of Cassian's people. Seraphine was in the penthouse when Ortega brought the news. She was at the kitchen counter with documents from the prosecutor's office and a cold cup of coffee, and she looked up when Ortega came in, and she saw his face. And she said, Dante. Yes. Where? He told her. Is he alive? A pause that lasted exactly as long as she needed to understand what the pause meant. Cassian's people found him deceased, Ortega said. Single gunshot wound. The room had been occupied for 3 days. The motel owner says he checked in alone and no one came or went. She looked at the counter. Self-inflicted, Ortega said. She absorbed that. She thought about the stairwell. The way Dante's voice had not shaken. It wasn't supposed to go this far. She thought about the specific quality of a man who had already arrived at a conclusion about himself and was simply completing the sequence of it. Where is Cassian? She said. His office. She went to the office door. It was closed. She knocked once and didn't wait for an answer. He was at his desk. The desk was clear. No files, no phone, nothing on the surface at all, which told her everything she needed to know about how long he'd been sitting there not working. She came in and closed the door and sat in the chair across from him. He looked at her. His face was doing the controlled thing, but beneath it, the same rawness she'd seen in the hospital recovery room, the same thing that lived under all the architecture of who he had built himself to be. I know, she said. He said nothing. It doesn't mean you wanted that, she said. What you wanted was an accounting. That's different. Is it? Yes. She held his gaze. You wanted him to face what he'd done. That's a legitimate thing to want. The fact that he couldn't, that's his failure, not yours. His jaw moved. He took 9 years of trust and used it as a weapon against everything I built. Yes. And now there's no... He stopped. No conclusion, she said. No moment where you get to see it resolved. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she understood about the specific grief of a betrayal like this. Not the grief of loss exactly, though that was in it, but the particular exhaustion of having to revise your understanding of an entire period of your life through the lens of what you now knew, of having to go back through 9 years of memories and re-examine every significant moment with new information about who was actually in the room. Can I tell you something? She said. He looked at her. When I was 18, she said, there was a woman who worked in the Vale estate, a housekeeper. She'd been there since before I was born. Her name was Mrs. Caro, and I thought she was the closest thing I had to a safe person in that house. I confided in her. Once, when I was 18, I told her something specific about what Roland had done to me. She paused. 3 days later, Roland knew what I'd told her. Cassian's face went very still. I spent a year trying to understand it, she said, why she'd done it, whether she was afraid of him, whether she'd been paid, whether she'd genuinely not understood what she was enabling by telling him. I never got a clean answer, and at some point I had to accept that I wasn't going to get one, and that the absence of a clean answer didn't change what I needed to do next. She held his gaze. You're not going to get a clean answer about Dante either. Whatever his reasons were, fear, money, ideology, his own particular kind of cowardice, they're his now. He took them with him. Cassian looked at her. The rawness in his face was closer to the surface than she'd seen it. What did you do? He said. After Mrs. Caro. I stopped trusting the wrong people, she said, and I started building toward this. She paused. That's what you do too. You've already started. The organization, the changes you've been making to how it operates, the things you've been moving away from. That's the answer to Dante. Not a clean conclusion, just the next thing, built better. The office was quiet. Outside the windows, Chicago was doing its February thing. Gray sky, ice on the river, the city insisting on itself anyway with the particular stubbornness of a place that had been through worse and knew it. Cassian looked at his desk, then at the window, then back at her. Come here, he said. She looked at him. Come here, he said again. And it wasn't a command, it wasn't operational, it was the quietest thing she had ever heard him say, and it had absolutely no armor in it. She got up and came around the desk, and he reached up with his good arm, and his hand found her forearm, and he held on to it with the grip of a man who was not accustomed to reaching for things, and had reached anyway, and she stood beside him and put her free hand on the top of his head, the way you put your hand on someone's head when words aren't the right tool for the thing that's happening, and she let him hold her arm, and she stood there, and she didn't move. They stayed like that for a long time. In March, Roland Vane was indicted on 47 federal counts. The indictment was unsealed on a Tuesday morning, and by noon it was the only story in Chicago. The specific nature of the charges, the scope of the trafficking network, the names of the powerful men documented in the Blackthorn sub-level binders, the duration of the operation, hit the city with the quality of something that people had perhaps suspected at the edges and had not known how to look at directly until the documentation existed that forced them to look. Seraphine watched the news coverage from the penthouse with coffee in her hands, and a strange, calm feeling that she didn't immediately recognize and then understood was relief, the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has set it down somewhere it will actually be held, somewhere it won't be lost or buried or explained away. Cassian was beside her. He watched the coverage with his usual stillness. When the reporter on screen began reading the names from the indictment, the aldermen, the judges, the political figures who had been present at Vale Estate functions and Roland Vane events for years, she felt the quality of his attention sharpen. Your father knew 2 of those men, he said. Yes. Well, yes. She kept her eyes on the screen. I've thought about whether I need to do something with that, whether there's a statement I should make or a clarification I owe someone. She paused. I don't think I do. What my father knew and looked away from is part of the record now, whether or not I address it directly. The documentation covers the period of his involvement. That's enough. Cassian was quiet. I'm not protecting him, she said. I want to be clear about that. I spent a long time being angry at him, for dying before I could ask him what he knew, for the things he must have known, for the possibility that some of what Roland was able to build was built on the foundation of my father's willingness to not ask the right questions. She set the coffee down. But I'm also not going to spend the rest of my life prosecuting a dead man in my own head. That's not justice. That's just a different kind of prison. Cassian turned to look at her. That's the most settled I've heard you sound about him, he said. I've had 8 weeks to think. What changed? She thought about it. I think I stopped waiting for him to be different than he was. In my memory, I mean. I kept revising him. Sometimes he was completely innocent and unknowing. Sometimes he was complicit in everything. And the truth is he was probably somewhere in the middle, and the middle is the hardest place to hold someone because it doesn't give you a clean feeling. She paused. But clean feelings aren't the point. He was my father, and he was imperfect, and he's dead. And what I do now is the only thing still in motion. But Cassian looked at her for a long moment. The organization, he said. She looked at him. I've been making structural changes over the last 6 weeks since the night at Blackthorn. I want to tell you what they are. He said it simply, directly, without the quality of asking permission, but with the quality of someone who understood that telling her was not optional. She turned toward him on the couch. Tell me. He did. He went through it methodically. The operations that had been closed, the routes that had been dismantled, the specific business arrangements that had survived for years because they were profitable and because nobody in the organization had been willing to look too carefully at what they were adjacent to. He went through the changes he was making to the organization's financial structure and the legal framework being built around its legitimate operations and the reduction of the activities that had no legitimate framework available to them. It took 40 minutes. She asked questions throughout, specific, practical questions, the questions of someone who was listening to the structural logic rather than the narrative of it. When he was done, the news was still on in the background, the coverage having moved on to the political dimension of the indictment. You've been building this for 6 weeks, she said. Yes. While recovering from a gunshot wound. I was in the hospital for 3 days. I have a phone. She looked at him. He looked back. The businesses that remain, she said, the ones that survived this restructuring, some of them are still outside the law. Yes. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She held his gaze directly. I'm also not going to pretend I don't understand what you are and what you've built and what the honest version of that looks like going forward. She paused. What I'm asking is whether what remains is the kind of thing I can stand in the same room with and look at clearly and not have it require me to look away. He held her gaze for a long moment. No trafficking, he said. No exploitation. Nothing that uses people as a resource. Those are absolutes. Not aspirations, not ideals. They're the floor, and everything below the floor is gone. He paused. What remains is territory, money, the management of certain markets that governments have decided to prohibit, but that exist regardless of prohibition. I'm not going to dress that up. I'm not asking you to dress it up. I know you're not. She looked at the window, at the city. I can stand in that room, she said. He exhaled. Not relief exactly, something quieter. The specific exhale of a person who has waited for an answer and has received it. There's something else, he said. She looked at him. The marriage, he said. The legal arrangement. The reason it was entered into. He was looking at the window. That no longer... He stopped. Began again. The purpose I constructed it for is done. Roland is in custody. The Vale family access was used for what I needed it for. The legal arrangement that exists between us was built for a specific purpose, and that purpose is... Cassian, she said. He stopped. She waited until he turned to look at her. I know what you're doing, she said. You're trying to give me an exit. You're trying to make it clear that the transaction is complete and I'm not obligated. She held his gaze. I understand why you're doing it. I even understand that you think it's the right thing to do. That releasing me from the arrangement is something you owe me. He said nothing. But I'm going to need you to stop, she said, because the way you're constructing this, as a transaction concluding, as an exit being offered, is not honest to what this actually is. And I've spent too long in circumstances that required me to accept the dishonest version of things, to accept it voluntarily now. His jaw moved. What is it actually? She looked at him, at the face she had learned over 3 weeks and a night at Blackthorn, and 8 weeks of recovery, and the specific landscape of him in the early morning and the late night, and the difficult middle parts of things. Something that started wrong, she said, and became real anyway, against every reasonable probability. She paused. I'm not interested in the exit. I'm interested in what comes after the exit that neither of us takes. He looked at her for a long time, the thing she'd watched develop over 3 weeks, the thing she'd refused to name because naming it early was how you broke it. She let herself name it now. Not out loud. Just internally, in the private part of her that had always known what it was, and had been waiting for the conditions to be right for the knowing to be safe. She watched the same thing happen in his face. Not the softening. Something deeper than the softening. Something that went all the way down through the controlled layers and the operational surface and the long history of a man who had decided early that efficiency was the appropriate response to pain. Something that reached the part of him that was none of those things, that was just a person who had had too little of too many things and had stopped expecting to receive them. He reached out with his good hand and he touched her face, just his fingers against her jaw, the lightest possible contact, the kind of touch that asked a question rather than stating a conclusion. She turned into it. That was her answer. Chet. The snow came in late March. It was unusual, a last refusal from a winter that hadn't finished saying what it had to say. And it fell across the city in the kind of clean, heavy blanket that quieted everything, that made Chicago look, for a few hours, like a photograph of itself rather than the real thing. Seraphine stood on the penthouse balcony in the early morning with a cup of coffee and watched it come down. The city below was white and still. The river was a dark seam through the white. The bridges carried their thin traffic. Somewhere in a federal detention facility on the city's south side, Roland Vane was in a cell, and the legal machinery that was going to define the remainder of his life was already in full motion and would not stop. Somewhere in the country, a ghost named Dante Reeve had already been laid to rest in a small private ceremony that Cassian had paid for without being asked, and had not attended and had not spoken about. And she had not asked him to speak about it, and she thought that the paying for it was its own kind of complicated, honest thing. Somewhere in the city's infrastructure, the trafficking network that had used Roland's organization and the Vale family name and the complicity of powerful men for 11 years was being taken apart, case by case, name by name, with the particular thoroughness of federal agencies that had been handed a complete record and had every incentive to use it fully. She drank her coffee. She thought about the women, the ones in the binders, the ones represented by the case numbers, and the dates and the transaction records that had been filed into evidence. She thought about the ones whose current situations might be improved by what was in those records, whose locations might be found, whose circumstances might be changed by the legal dismantling of the structure that had moved them. She thought about those ones for whom it was too late, for whom the documentation existed but the timeline was already closed, the damage already done in ways that no prosecution could reach back far enough to address. She held both groups in her mind. The weight of the second group was heavier. She knew it would always be heavier. She had decided to hold it rather than look away from it because looking away was how the second group kept growing, and she had had enough of looking away. The balcony door opened behind her. Cassian came out in a dark sweater and no jacket because he had never once in 3 weeks of her observation worn enough layers for the weather, and he stood beside her and looked at the snow on the city. She handed him her coffee. He took it without comment. They stood side by side, looking at Chicago under its late snow, and she thought about a night 3 months ago when she had walked down a different aisle in a silk dress that felt like a burial shroud, and a man had leaned close during a vow and said something that was meant to be the beginning of her undoing. She thought about what that man knew then and what he knew now, and the specific distance between those two knowings. "I need to find a prosecutor for the civil cases," she said. "The women who can be located from the documentation. There should be civil claims alongside the criminal prosecution. The financial compensation from Roland's estates and holdings, there's a significant amount there, and it should go somewhere specific." Cassian turned to look at her. "I know someone," he said. "I assumed you did. It's going to take time." "I know. Years, possibly, before—" "I know, Cassian." She looked at him. "I'm not in a hurry. I'm in a direction." She paused. "There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "The foundation," he said. "The Moretti Foundation. The legitimate one, the education work. It could be restructured, the mandate expanded. Something that addresses the specific infrastructure failure that allows operations like Roland's to function. Legal support, housing, access to advocacy." He said it the way he said things that mattered to him, not with enthusiasm, with precision, as if making sure the proposition was structurally sound before presenting it. There would be significant funding available from the reorganization of the organization's holdings. She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "Since the hospital. 3 days after being shot." I told you I have a phone. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something in her chest expanded. Not warmth exactly, more like the specific feeling of a space that had been contracted for a long time, discovering it was allowed to open. Yes, she said. He nodded once, drank the coffee, looked back at the city. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Tell me. The night of the wedding, what you said during the vows. He went still. I know you told me in the hospital that you would have handled it differently. She kept her eyes on the city. And I believed you. I believe you still. She paused. But I also need you to know that I heard it and it landed, and the specific thing it did to me. She stopped, breathed. I had been told versions of that for years. That I was a consequence, that my existence was a liability, that my primary function in the world was to absorb the cost of other people's actions. She turned to look at him, and then you said it on top of everything else I was already carrying into that building. And I need you to know that it was one of the hardest moments I had in a night full of hard moments. He held her gaze. I know, he said. I'm not. She took a breath. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because I don't want it to exist between us as the thing that isn't said. Because things that aren't said become the weight of a room eventually, and I have lived in rooms with too much unspoken weight. She held his gaze steadily. I need you to hear that it happened, and I need you to say you heard it. I heard it, he said. Okay. I said it, he said. I said it to a woman I didn't know, about sins that weren't hers, in the middle of an act I constructed entirely from my own anger about a man who was already dead. He said it directly, without flinching away from the specific contour of it. I heard what I said the moment I said it, and I have thought about it every day since. He paused. I cannot give it back, I know that. She looked at him. No, she said, but you can be the person who doesn't say it again to anyone. A long pause. Yes, he said, that I can do. She looked at the city. The snow was still falling, slower now, in larger flakes, the kind that came at the end of a storm when it had finished being urgent and was just completing itself. Below them, the river was dark and the bridges were white-dusted, and the buildings stood in their ordinary configurations doing their ordinary work. She thought about the 17-year-old in the Vale Estate hallway, the one she'd seen in the dream, the one she'd wanted to call out to, warn, give something to that would make what was coming survivable. She thought about what she would say to her, if she could. Not much, actually. Not a speech. Just, you're going to make it through. You're going to be so angry and so tired and so alone for so long, and you're going to carry things that aren't yours to carry, and it is going to cost you things you don't have words for. But you're going to make it through, and you're going to do something real with the other side of it. That was it. That was all. She put her hand on Cassian's arm, not the injured shoulder, the other one, her palm against the dark fabric of his sweater, feeling the warmth of him underneath it. And she felt him turn toward her slightly, the weight of him shifting, the particular way he moved toward things he had decided to stop moving away from. It's cold, she said. I know. We should go inside. In a minute, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the city, at the snow on the river and the white quiet of the early morning and the bridges carrying their thin traffic through the end of the storm. I married you to destroy your life, he said. He said it quietly, plainly, as a statement of fact, not self-flagellating, not performing remorse, just holding the fact of it in the air between them where it could be looked at clearly. She held his gaze. I know, she said. And instead, he stopped. Something moved through his face, past the controlled layers, all the way down to the part of him that had been waiting, she thought, for a long time to be allowed to be something other than what the years had made necessary. Instead, you became the only reason I still have a soul worth saving. She looked at him for a long moment. The snow came down. She reached up and put her scarred hand flat against his chest, directly over his heartbeat, and she felt it, steady, present, real. And she held it there, and he covered her hand with his, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that the two of them standing in the snow at the top of the city didn't already say better. The city moved through its mourning below them. The storm finished itself. And for the first time since any of it had begun, neither of them felt haunted by the shape of what they'd survived. They just felt the cold and the warmth and the specific weight of a hand placed deliberately over a heartbeat. They just felt that. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.